A woo! A howl resounded through the darkened cavern. It was not only loud, but carried the power of the sun itself. Everything within the vicinity lit up as though morning had arrived. The shadows retreated as several undead creatures slithering along the cavern walls were revealed. Quite the useful skill, Roland commented while raising the hammer staff in his hand. Energy gathered, and mana radiated with divine light as a burst shot toward the shadowy figure before him. One strike was enough, but Roland continued watching carefully as the creature slammed against the cavern wall. The undead monstrosity twitched violently while golden flames spread across its blackened flesh. Moments later, the corpse dissolved into ash that scattered across the damp stone floor. Lesser Dragon Shadestalker has been slain. Your holy power is becoming stronger and stronger. Worf. Agni wagged his tail in delight at the praise from his master. Roland smiled beneath his helmet and stretched out a hand before moving on. The runes engraved into his gauntlet began glowing faintly, and the remains of the defeated creature drifted into a small vial he held. Can't sell it on the main market, but Rastix and the Thieves' Guild will be glad to have it. He glanced at the ashen remains of the phantom monster. The lesser dragon Shadestalker was not an easy creature to kill, at least by conventional means. It was completely resistant to physical attacks and most forms of magic, but holy energy left it nearly defenseless. The creature could not be harmed while hidden within the shadows, and ordinary light did little to weaken it. Only powerful priests possessed enough divine magic to make it vulnerable to damage, but with Agni around, that problem no longer existed. I'm almost out of time. I wish I could clone myself. Roland let out a disappointed sigh as he checked the time display within his helmet. Although he wanted to continue deeper into the ruins, his growing workload left him with little freedom. The massive golem he was constructing was progressing far too slowly, and there was barely enough time for anything else. Soon, he and Agni made their way through the ruins toward the hidden teleportation gate at the main checkpoint, and they were not alone. Woof! No, you can't kill this one. We need it for the others. Worf! No, you can't go after the other one either. Just let me work here, okay? Agni snorted while Roland looked toward an unmoving undead Amphiptera. The monster stood beside an undead draconic lord that had already been restrained with thick metallic bindings and locked inside a cage. Both creatures were under the effects of his necrotic energy emulation and remained stationed at the teleportation checkpoint he had established within the hidden draconic ruins. The underground chamber was quiet aside from the occasional growl echoing from the restrained monsters and the scratching of Roland's tools against metal plating. Pale blue crystals were embedded in the walls now, placed there by Roland himself. They resembled the tube lights from his previous life and had been fixed to the ceiling to brighten the room. Embedding objects into dungeon walls usually caused the dungeon to slowly seal the gaps with stone and restore itself to its original shape. However, there were ways around this. One method involved using inorganic materials or, as in this case, special glowing crystals capable of absorbing ambient mana from their surroundings. These crystals were common in many regions and especially useful in dungeons, where they served as reliable light sources. The added light made navigating the area much easier. Normally, undead creatures were drawn to light and certain mana wavelengths, but Roland could suppress and conceal those signals with ease. Even if the crystals remained active, the undead would not wander through. A heavy door had been installed to block both the light and the mana wavelengths from spreading beyond the chamber. Awoo! Can you be quiet for once? I know you're eager, but give me some time to focus. Agni was restless, pacing around with twitching legs, and for good reason. Some time had passed since Julius had arrived and discovered this place. Nearly half a year had also passed since Roland had made his deal with the headmistress. During that time, Agni's level had risen dramatically, bringing him closer and closer to a new evolution. The wolf wanted nothing more than to grind through the ruins and hunt the high-level undead lurking within, but Roland rarely had the time. Other responsibilities constantly dragged him away from the dungeon. Roland pressed his fingers against the metallic collar wrapped around the undead Amphiptera's neck while thin streams of mana flowed through the engraved runes. The creature trembled as the restraints glowed brightly. A moment later, it began thrashing violently when the effect of the emulated necromancy was removed. Seems to be holding steady. The monster slammed against the ground with a heavy thud, but it could not move far. Thick metallic shackles forged from the same material found within the ruins tightly restrained its body. Grr. It's fine, Agni, it can't get free. Roland stopped Agni from attacking and activated the necrotic runes to disable the creature once more. The metallic collar glowed with a greenish hue and, within seconds, the Amphiptera stopped struggling. The test had been successful. Even without the spell active, the restraints could keep the creature contained. The monster returned to its docile state, confirming that Roland's efforts had not been wasted. Soon, Arthur and the others would have durable training dummies they could strike again and again. "We're done here for now, Agni. Let's go." With that, Roland prepared to leave. He had an appointment waiting for him elsewhere. Agni looked thoroughly displeased, still eager to continue training. One glance at his status screen told Roland exactly why the wolf was so restless, but leveling would have to wait a little longer. Name: Sunlight Wolf Divine Form L241. Type: Fire/Earth/Divine Beast. HP: 61442/60441. MP: 55480/49341. SP: 85538/75522. Strength: 456. Agility: 612. Dexterity: 357. Vitality: 529. Endurance: 580. Intelligence: 526. Willpower: 510. Charisma: 22. Luck: 18. There wasn't much left of the journey, and along the way, Agni had managed to learn a few useful skills. Solar Howl. Active skill. Releases a resonant howl that channels concentrated sunlight, dealing massive divine and fire damage in a cone or wide area. Particularly devastating against undead, demons, and shadow-based creatures. It can also dispel darkness effects and cleanse lesser curses. It was the skill he had used to help defeat the phantom of the undead lesser dragon. While it lacked power against ordinary foes, there was nothing better in Agni's repertoire when it came to fighting hordes of undead or phantoms. The attack could be unleashed in every direction, and it would not harm Agni or anyone the wolf considered an ally. Aegis of Dawn. Active skill. Generates a shimmering shield of solidified sunlight around the user or an ally. Absorbs dark, shadow, or necrotic damage and converts part of it into healing. This was another handy skill. It created bubbles of radiant energy around Agni or his allies. Ordinary people would quickly grow sick from the necrotic mana in the air, but while protected by the divine barrier, they remained unaffected. The skill could be used on multiple allies at once, though sustaining the shields reduced Agni's maximum mana capacity. Blessing of the Sun. Active skill. Grants nearby allies increased strength, speed, and resistance to fear and dark energies. Their weapons and attacks gain temporary holy and fire damage that gradually fades as it is used. The last notable skill was a support ability. It functioned like a blessing similar to many priest spells, but with a dual elemental aspect that made it especially effective. After seeing these abilities, it was no surprise that the Solarian Church wanted control over his wolven companion. Agni was essentially a walking support unit that could create shields to repel unholy energies while strengthening allies from a distance. I wonder if that was why she wanted him. They probably know every skill a Sunlight Wolf can gain and all its possible future evolutions. The Solarian Church was an organization that had existed for hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of years. They undoubtedly understood the full potential Agni possessed. While their doctrine claimed that the holy beast should remain free to choose its own path, there were likely those within the church who did not entirely agree with that belief. Then there was his own status window, which had also grown immensely but was becoming increasingly difficult to advance. He had spent 25 levels in a Tier 1 class, and now he was beginning to feel the effects of that sluggish progression. Name: Roland Arden L252. Classes: T3 Runesmith Overlord L77 Primary, T2 Runesmith Lord L50 Tertiary, T2 Runic Engineer L50 Secondary, T1 Mage L25X, T1 Runic Mana Scribe L25X, T1 Runic Blacksmith L25X. HP: 71291/71291. MP: 99895/133677. SP: 89543/96774. Strength: 475. Agility: 390. Dexterity: 527. Vitality: 499. Endurance: 537. Intelligence: 621. Willpower: 601. Charisma 21. Luck 12. Even though he was above the regular threshold, he still needed more than 20 levels to get there, and for some people, that could mean years of crafting and training. The creatures within this dungeon did not exceed level 260, so progressing beyond that point would probably become difficult. Agni, on the other hand, still had plenty of room to grow since his level had not even reached the middle of the 200s yet. The most noticeable skill he had gained was Overlord's Indomitable Will, which had saved him from certain doom the last time. Its level had not increased much, as he realized that leveling it was an incredibly tedious process. The skill regenerated his health whenever it dropped below 25%, but triggering it meant injuring himself on purpose. He was not much of a masochist, so stabbing himself or exposing himself to poison was not exactly appealing. Poison would probably be the more humane option, but it would also take much longer since he had already built up resistance to most harmful substances. Rune Brand L1. Active skill. Inscribe a powerful runic brand on an enemy. Branded targets take increased damage from all your runes, and you can easily track their position. This was one of the new skills he had gained, though it did not seem particularly powerful at first glance. Still, it had its uses. After running a few tests, he discovered that he could place the brand on living beings without causing them any discomfort. The mark was undetectable through normal means and did not appear on a person's status screen. The biggest drawback was that the skill required direct physical contact to apply. In addition, if he used a damaging spell on a branded target, the mark would instantly dissolve after amplifying the damage by roughly 25%. While the damage boost was decent, the fact that it only worked once made the skill feel somewhat impractical. In the time it took him to apply the brand and follow up with an attack spell, he could probably do something more useful in actual combat. Even so, the tracking capability was difficult to ignore. The tracking itself was somewhat vague. He could sense the brand within a range of about a kilometer, but the farther away the target moved, the weaker the connection became. The test subject he had branded was now in Albrook, and since he was currently inside the dungeon, he could no longer sense them at all. Maybe the range will increase if I level it further. If someone uses illusion magic or some kind of escape skill, this could become very useful. Some classes could transform into shadows, create magical clones that scattered in different directions, or use countless other methods to escape detection. If he managed to place this runic brand on someone, he would be able to track them easily during a fight or even follow them without their knowledge. The skill's greatest strength was how difficult it was to detect through ordinary identification methods. Even powerful mages were unable to see through it. Then there was another skill he had received. Considering everything he had already managed to learn on his own, it was not particularly enticing. Still, it had its uses, as it allowed him to achieve an effect similar to true runic psi without the migraine and bleeding eyes. Runic Mimicry L1. Active skill. Copy a target's active spell or enchantment as a rune, which can then be instantly imbued onto a piece of equipment of your choosing. How closely the spell or enchantment resembles the original depends on the skill level and the user's intelligence. Roland could already copy the spells of others and even emulate the energies used by magical classes he should not have been capable of replicating. This skill granted him a similar ability, though it came with both advantages and drawbacks. One advantage was that he could perform it instantly without needing to analyze the spell beforehand. Once he placed the rune onto a piece of equipment, he was given the complete runic structure, which he could then copy onto something that could carry the rune. It was also something that could be used in the middle of battle, though he was not entirely sure what the point of copying another person's spell would be. He could already modify his runic equipment on the fly, and doing so consumed far less MP than this skill. However, if he encountered a particularly difficult spell that was hard to grasp, he could see himself relying on this skill instead of his usual process of deduction and experimentation. About the titles. Awoo. Fine, let's just go then, Agni. You were exceptionally good today, so you can have your fill of mana crystals. Agni wagged his tail instantly after hearing that he would be allowed to munch on magical crystals. Once everything was prepared and the gate activated, Roland pushed the two bound undead through it. Then he and Agni stepped through as well, arriving at his workshop once again. As soon as he got there, he quickly moved the two monsters into the contamination cells that had been prepared for them. One was located within his own compound, while the other was closer to Arthur's mansion, where he intended to continue training his skills. With that done, he was ready to return to work, and it seemed the man he had called for had already arrived. Agni is back to playing outside, the city is secure, and now I finally have time to gather some valuable combat data. The halfway point of the competition was finally upon him. In just a week, he would need to visit the school, where the students' test results would be posted. From that group, participants for the various competitions would be selected, and he would then need to analyze their strengths and weaknesses, as he was responsible for providing them with support items for their bouts. There were various competitions. Some were as simple as races on magical beasts, while others were far more elaborate, like cooking contests that used alchemical ingredients alongside regular food and meat from rare animal breeds. I could probably construct a runic cooking pot or stove for them. The concept of a microwave doesn't exist here either. As ideas flooded his mind, he headed for the elevator where the guest he had summoned was already waiting outside. When he arrived, he raised a hand in greeting. "Hi, Commander Wayland." The man wore heavy armor covered in runes, though not nearly as many as the set Roland usually wore. "You don't need to do that here. No one can hear or see us, Robert." Roland pointed to his exposed face. Robert responded by removing his helmet and letting out a sigh. "I don't mind wearing armor, but being forced to keep it on all the time is somewhat bothersome," Robert complained as he approached. Roland smiled slightly. "Then you can relax. You won't need heavy armor today. First, we need to get you into a silver grace suit, and then we can begin." Robert nodded, though he still looked confused. "You told me to come here, but you never explained what we'd be doing." "Oh, nothing much. You'll just be piloting a golem." "Piloting?" Roland smiled again but offered no explanation. Instead, he gestured toward the elevator entrance, and the two stepped inside. Agni remained outside, munching on magical rocks while his entire stable shook from the heavy thumping of his tail. "Is this part of the piloting?" Robert stood inside a mostly white room. Around him was a strange framework with what looked like large golemic eyes attached to it. He was also wearing an unusual suit. It was a type of silver grace suit, though not one designed to attach armor. The suit was mostly black, with white metal spheres attached at several points. Small runes had been engraved into the metal, pulsing faintly with magical power. On his back was something resembling a backpack that held a runic battery to power the strange suit. "This isn't a battle suit, right?" "No. It's something called a motion capture suit. It will help me record your movements and the way you fight." "I see." It was clear that Robert had no idea what Roland was talking about, though that was to be expected. The suit was inspired by technology from modern filmmaking and game development. Roland had recreated parts of it through runes and his own operating system. It paled in comparison to what existed in the modern world, but it still provided him with a large amount of useful data. "It will be much easier for me to customize your mobile runic armor if I know exactly how you move and which attacks you prefer." "Mobile runic armor?" "Yes. That's the name of the new golem I'm designing. You can call it MRA for short." Robert clearly wanted to ask why Roland had chosen that name, but answering would require explaining concepts from his original world. Roland had combined several familiar terms with the sensibilities of this one. In the end, it was still best to describe this mechanized suit of armor as a golem, since a golem unit remained at the center of its operation. The machine simply read the movements of the pilot inside and reacted accordingly, while lacking the ability to move independently. That did not mean Roland intended to leave out an autopilot function. Too many things could happen during combat. The pilot could become injured or lose consciousness. If that happened, the onboard golem core would temporarily assume control and retreat to safety. Even after all his golemic research, including the information he had gained from Hassim, Roland still believed that a person controlling the golem from within would achieve better results. Large-scale golems were sluggish and difficult to manufacture. Their strengths lay in their durability and overwhelming attacks. Still, that was not the true purpose behind this technology. Creating Tier 2 or Tier 3 golems was possible, but extremely expensive. Their programming was also simplistic, and they usually required a mage or craftsman to control them directly. They were poor at making decisions on their own, since they were typically designed for either combat or construction. He wasn't sure where this technology had its limits. In theory, it was probably better to place low-level people with battle classes, or even those without any class at all, into power suits or larger units so they could control them in battle. There was likely a limit to how fast an MRA could move when factoring in both the pilot and the Mana Phantom. Reaction speed and processing power would also have their limits, requiring specialized materials and programming. However, these power suits were relatively cheap to produce as long as they remained below Tier 3. More importantly, they could bridge the gap between tiers and levels, as Robert's previous power armor had already demonstrated. Roland was aware that this technology could be militarized and would allow the kingdom to arm people who normally would not be capable of fighting. However, there was still something that worried him. If the technology were stolen or copied, it could easily lead to more wars. Those in power might see these enhanced armies as enough reason to conquer more land and seize additional resources. He did not mind if they were used for defensive measures against the empires surrounding the kingdom or against the growing cultist threat. Yet he could not predict what would come afterward. Would the king attempt to expand further and continue the bloodshed, or would he use this power only to protect the citizens? Well, I bet the other countries are trying to develop their own weapons. It's not like I can rely on their generosity either. Through his life in this world, he had come to realize that it resembled the older eras of his previous one. National borders could change several times within a single century. Wars were constant, and every nation struggled to become the stronger side. If one country discovered a new weapon, the others would rush to create something equal or superior. It was an endless cycle that mirrored the arms races of the world he had come from, and perhaps he would end up shaping the future conflicts that arose here as well. I'm not sure I'm a good enough person to think about others. As he reflected on the situation, he thought about the people he had become involved with. Elydia, Arthur, Bernier, and many others were people he wanted to protect. He wanted to preserve the small place he had carved out for himself in this country, and for that to happen, he needed to become much stronger. And placing a hidden backdoor in the runic program shouldn't be difficult. There were several ways he could prevent his technology from being stolen. He could lock the system down completely, or even allow the technology to spread intentionally. If someone ever tried to use it against him, he could simply regain control through a concealed countermeasure embedded deep within the main program. The people in this world lacked the programming knowledge needed to uncover something like that, at least not before it was too late. Interesting name, so what should I do? His thoughts shifted back to the present and the data he still needed to gather before the prototype could be finalized. For now, just move naturally. Walk around the room first. Robert nodded and took a cautious step forward. The strange metallic spheres attached to the suit glimmered faintly as he moved. At the same time, several floating runic drones appeared around him and followed closely behind. They gathered data from every angle while keeping themselves within the sphere's line of sight to record his skeletal structure and movements. It was a somewhat quiet exchange. Robert was not someone who spoke much. As a professional knight, he had learned to hold his tongue in front of his superiors. Even though Roland was his younger brother, Robert had no trouble seeing him as the leader. It was not unusual for knights to take orders from younger nobles either. For a while, the two remained silent before Roland finally brought up the issue that had been bothering him for some time. "Robert, are you really sure about this?" By now, Robert had moved onto the more stable platform equipped with the better golemic cameras. He swung a practice greatsword through the air, demonstrating his movements. "What do you mean?" Robert stopped mid-swing as Roland broke the silence between them. "You're putting yourself in danger by going to the kingdom. Even if you wear a suit that conceals your face, we do not know what could happen. Your identity could still be revealed." "It could, but so could yours, brother. Besides, when else will I have the chance to see my mother and sister?" Robert answered calmly, and Roland fell silent for a moment. At first, he had not been sure whether to tell his older brother, but once he learned that Lucienne had returned to the institute, he could not keep it from him. Robert was still the best pilot for the task. Roland trusted him with his work, and he had already analyzed Robert's mana phantom thoroughly, which had saved a great deal of time. "Do you still think about them?" "Of course. They are my mother and sister, and I should apologize for the way my mother treated you in the past." "Oh, that? It's fine. You were the one chasing me around the estate, not her." Roland laughed while Robert lowered his head in embarrassment. "Do not worry about it. You were just a child worried about your place in the family. Even so, what I did was wrong. If you feel that bad about it, then just win the competition and carry out your knightly duties while you are in Albrook." "Of course." Robert nodded with renewed enthusiasm. "Once this is all over, perhaps you could become an official knight of House Valerian. We would just need Arthur or Julius to inherit the title first." "Haha, that would be wonderful, brother. It would be an honor to pledge myself to such a renowned house, but..." Although Robert was clearly interested in becoming a proper knight, and serving a duke was second only to serving the royal family itself, something still troubled him. Roland already knew what it was. You would be joining the opposing faction, but I am not sure father would object. In the end, we are still part of the same kingdom. Robert lowered the practice blade and rested it against his shoulder. Perhaps not, but others in the family might. Father spent years building connections among the royalist nobles. Some of them already see House Valerian as a rival. By family. Do you mean Rainer and Edwin? When he mentioned their two other brothers, he noticed a slight twitch on Robert's face. It was clear that his older brother still carried deep-seated trauma connected to the two sons born to their father's main wife. In the past, Robert had desperately tried to surpass them and prove his worth, but in the end, he abandoned everything to escape with Lucille. Brother Edwin and eldest brother Rainer will probably be too busy to come, but I'm sure mother will be there if Lucienne attends, and that's all that matters. After a moment, Robert recovered and picked up the practice sword again. His swings were stronger now, as if he were trying to bury something from his past. Roland had long since left the family business behind and no longer cared much about the other two brothers. They rarely visited him, as they had never considered him competition in the struggle over who would become the next Baron Arden once their father retired. The two of them competed fiercely with each other, their ages being close, and both of them were accomplished knights. Roland had only heard rumors about where they had gone, but from what he knew, they currently served under noble houses allied with the Arden estate. Even if they come, there shouldn't be any problems. They hardly noticed me in the past, so there's no reason for them to care about what I'm doing now. Even so, the familiar troubles of the Arden estate still lingered in his mind. He remained wary of his father, Wentworth. Now that the man had become a marshal and likely gained even more power, Roland would not feel comfortable confronting him until he reached Tier 4 himself. The pressure continued to build, and he knew that eventually he would have to face the issue head-on. Silence soon returned between the two of them, as Roland had no desire to revisit old family wounds. For the next few hours, he observed Robert's movements and measured his proportions. For the golem to function properly, it needed to closely match the body type of its pilot. The golem operated by mimicking the movements of the person controlling it. It replicated the motion of the arms and legs with remarkable precision. If the proportions were off, such as the legs being too short or too long, it would throw off the machine's balance, though there were ways to compensate for that. By designing an operating program capable of translating movements into adjusted ones that preserved the golem's balance, such problems could be overcome. For now, however, it was best to customize the outer shell as precisely as possible, since any corrections made by the program would increase the delay between the pilot and the machine. That should be enough for now. I think I have enough data for the model. Let's move on to the next stage. Robert had been forced to run around and perform various strange poses while testing both his flexibility and swordsmanship. Now it was time to proceed to the next phase, as the initial framework for the pilot cockpit had already been constructed and also required testing. What would you have me do now, brother? Now you can actually put on the silver grace suit. As soon as he finished speaking, a humanoid golem walked through the entrance carrying the suit in its hands. It was Sebastian, whom Lucille had previously worked on. Regrettably, she could not be here, as someone had to remain in charge of the other city while Robert was away. Robert said nothing as he accepted the prepared suit. It resembled a wetsuit used by scuba divers in the modern world. There was no need for a zipper because once worn, magic caused it to tighten slightly around the body while still remaining flexible. With the suit on, they moved through the workshop. His apprentice was there as well, sitting in her room and continuing to improve several runic manufacturing skills. Roland chose not to interrupt her. Her ascension trial was approaching, and once he finished with Robert, she would become his main priority again. Robert looked somewhat uncomfortable walking around in the skin-tight suit, but Roland assured him that no one else was there to see him. Eventually, the two arrived at the lowest level of the workshop, where the runic mobile armor frame had been assembled. The cockpit rested nearby, open and detached from the main structure. The interior of the cockpit was circular and designed around gyroscopic stabilization technology that would keep the pilot steady even if the outer frame lost balance. Countless runic pathways covered the inner shell, glowing faintly in shades of blue and silver. Several thick cords extended from the pod and connected to an external console containing the primary control program. So this is the mobile runic armor. It's only part of it. This is called the cockpit. You'll sit inside it and control the golem. You can see the screens there, right? Screens, I know what that is at least. Robert came from this world and lacked the scientific knowledge needed to fully understand what Roland was describing. Fortunately, he had undergone extensive training and possessed a solid education in other areas. The gyroscopically stabilized pod contained 3 monitors positioned in front of the pilot. One displayed the forward view while the other 2 showed the sides and rear. He would need time to adjust to relying on them while seated inside the cramped cockpit, which had been carefully designed to allow proper movement. In addition, a harness would secure him in place. It would keep him steady during impacts and vibrations from combat. It also ensured he remained centered inside the circular pod because excessive movement could cause the pilot to collide with the inner shell during sudden shocks. The cockpit itself absorbed much of the force, but Roland preferred multiple layers of protection. The harness also functioned as another medium for reading the Mana Phantom and connected directly to the Silver Grace suit, which transmitted additional information through it. So I'll be moving that large golem while standing inside this. Robert pointed to the exposed pod and then to the golem assembled nearby. The legs, torso, and one arm were already attached, but the rest was still unfinished. Yes, though eventually this cockpit will be installed inside the golem's chest cavity. Try to protect that area as much as possible during combat. I see. Robert nodded. Rather than looking cautious, he seemed genuinely fascinated by what this was becoming. Without needing further instruction, he stepped into the circular cockpit and examined the interior with curiosity. The harness hanging above swayed slightly when he touched it. So I stand here. Yes. Place your feet on the marked circles first. Robert followed the instructions while Roland helped secure the harness around him. Once he finished strapping him in, Roland moved to the side console and began pressing buttons. Suddenly, the runes inside the pod started glowing, and the panels in front of Robert lit up as well. Mobile runic armor, operating system starting. Robert read the glowing words slowly, as if unsure whether he had pronounced them correctly. A moment later, the symbols on the screen shifted, and several new lines appeared beneath them. Pilot link initialized. Mana Phantom detected. Sync ratio, 24%. What is a sync ratio? It measures how well the armor responds to your Mana Phantom and how accurately it translates your movements. Don't worry. Once I calibrate a few more things, it should increase. But for now, let's begin and see how the connection works. As Roland spoke, the figure beside them reacted to Robert's movements. Its right arm lifted, mirroring the position Robert had taken inside the cockpit. Everything appeared to be functioning properly, though this was still only an alpha test and much more work remained. Even so, Roland found himself wondering how people would react once the invention was complete and how it would compare to the regular golems created by dwarves and other master craftsmen. The metallic arm rose with a heavy groan. There was no outer shell yet, only a skeletal frame of dark alloy reinforced with thick runic channels running along the joints. Blue light pulsed through the engraved pathways like veins carrying blood. Inside the cockpit, Robert shifted slightly, and the construct mirrored him a second later. This is... Robert watched the frame beside him respond to his movements. The delay was obvious. A massive lag passed before the construct reacted, yet seeing the enormous metallic frame move as if it were an extension of his own body was fascinating. The delay will be the first issue we must overcome, but it will never truly reflect your movements, at least not with this model. Roland spoke while studying the monitors and the flowing streams of information appearing across them. The runes embedded into the cockpit walls flickered in response to Robert's Mana Phantom while dozens of calculations passed through the operating system. The larger the frame becomes, the harder it is to achieve instant movement. Weight, mana transmission, signal conversion, all of it creates delay. Once the prototype is ready, you'll have to adapt to how it functions. Robert slowly lowered the metallic arm, then raised it again. I think I get it. I'll have to predict the movements instead of simply reacting. But will that magic I used during the trial work here too? By magic, you mean the one that helped you predict the other knight's movements? Yes, that. I'm not sure, it's too early to say. I see. Roland had used the Mana Phantom to predict the movements of opponents and monsters alike. The system worked by reading the movements produced by a being's soul before the body itself reacted. However, things became more complicated with beings like golems. If he asked someone whether a golem had a soul, most people would say no because it was a being made of magic. Yet both answers could be correct at the same time. The Mana Phantom always moved before the body, that much was true. Even inanimate objects could contain soul energy, as Bernier had already demonstrated. However, combining such objects together did not necessarily create something with a true soul. He believed the reason for that was the world system. Regular beings in this world were tied to the system and possessed some form of status screen. This applied to naturally born creatures as well as dungeon-created monsters. Against them, he could use the prediction system without issue. Golems assembled from old golem cores or artificially created ones were different. Their connection to the system existed not as living beings but as items, which prevented the prediction system from functioning properly. The golems he would face in the competition would all possess customized cores rather than restored monster cores. That much was certain. The dwarven craftsmen were far too proud to rely on monster-made components, even if doing so would save them time. Either way, he would be unable to predict the movements of the golemic machines in the same way he could predict those of living beings. In the future, it might be possible to develop a method to calculate those predictions instead, as each golem operated through a program that reacted to combat situations and followed specific behavioral patterns. Even though the dwarven craftsmen took pride in making everything by hand from start to finish, that did not mean they improved much on the old golem programming. Their methods were shaped by tradition and stubbornness, both of which he could exploit. Most master craftsmen relied on proven rune programming passed down through generations, and they disliked working with rune mages. Altering the systems too much was considered dangerous, especially when a single mistake could cause a golem to go berserk or collapse in the middle of battle. There was also only a limited variety of golem types. Most were humanoid in shape with standardized joints and movement patterns because those designs were reliable and easy to maintain. His opponents favored stability over innovation, but that did not mean he would not face serious opposition. Even a predictable machine was dangerous, especially one perfected over generations. Then there was the issue of actually damaging them. Even if Robert could react in time and land hits, it would mean little if he could not get through the thick armor plating. For that reason, he needed to create a weapon capable of doing exactly that. Robert was a swordsman, but swords were not particularly effective against heavy armor. Still, at this size, the sheer weight of such a blade could allow it to function almost like a bludgeoning weapon. With the right enchantments and a few structural adjustments, he could create something capable of piercing metals stronger than mithril itself. This feels awkward, and shouldn't the legs be moving? Robert commented as he shifted around inside the pod. He quickly noticed that although his own legs were moving, the large golem's legs remained still. I deactivated them for now, but this is probably a good opportunity to test it. Wait a moment. Roland replied before activating something with a glance at the mobile runic armor. The frame was attached to several thick metallic cables, which soon lifted it slightly off the ground. It was not raised by much, only enough for the legs to hang freely. Activating the leg sensors. Try moving around. Now that the large golem frame was secured in place, they could begin the test. Just as expected, the movements felt awkward because there was no forward momentum inside the pilot's cockpit. The moment Robert tried to walk normally, he stumbled forward inside the cockpit. The harness holding him in place kept him steady, but he struggled to mimic a proper walking cycle, at least at first. There was also the problem of his legs moving faster than the machine could keep up with, causing the golem's movements to become uneven and unnatural. Roland wasn't sure how quickly he would be able to make the golem move, but the unnatural way his brother struggled to walk would need to be fixed. He could already see several possible solutions. One option was to have Robert learn a specific walking pattern that the golem could imitate and consistently follow. Another was to implement a small assistance system that would compensate for movements that were too erratic or too fast. There was also a third approach, installing movement-limiting devices. He imagined them as metallic boots that would make movement more difficult while allowing Robert to feel the weight behind the golem he was controlling. He could do something similar for the hands by installing gloves or another type of controller that Robert could grip and physically feel. I could expand the harness, but there might not be enough space, perhaps magnetic force. In his mind, he was already assembling the inner workings of his mobile armor. If he implemented magnetic magic that pushed and pulled against Robert's arms, he could probably simulate the golem's true movements far more accurately. That would allow Robert to adapt to the machine much faster while making it feel as though he was genuinely controlling the golem instead of simply flailing his limbs around awkwardly. Let us run a few more tests. After thinking it through, he had a rough idea of the direction he wanted to take. This was exactly why he had brought Robert in for testing, as both practical and theoretical experiments needed to be conducted. For the next several hours, they continued refining the control interface and pushing the prototype through increasingly demanding movement tests. Robert's learning curve was steep at first. Walking remained awkward, each step inside the cockpit slightly out of sync with the massive construct outside. They also tested the stabilizers on the rotating cockpit to see whether Robert could keep his balance if the golem fell over or was slammed against a wall. The results were eye-opening. The cockpit automatically shifted itself perfectly level and kept him standing upright, which was perhaps not the ideal outcome. If the golem fell over while Robert remained standing normally inside, the movements required to get back up would become awkward and unintuitive. Roland began to wonder if the entire platform should move along with the golem while Robert's feet remained strapped into the metallic boots. If the construct fell, the cockpit would tilt and rotate accordingly, placing him in the same position as the golem outside. That would make reacting to external movements much easier and eliminate much of the awkwardness. The sync ratio displayed on the monitor continued creeping upward as the day went on, but eventually the tests were halted, and his brother was finally allowed to step out of the machine. "How was it?" "I'm not sure, but I can say that I'm intrigued," Robert answered as he carefully stepped out of the circular cockpit. His legs felt slightly unsteady after spending half the day standing on the platform and moving around inside it. The runic light illuminating the future golem pod gradually dimmed, and before long, everything was shut down. "Glad to hear that. You'll have to come here a few more times, but until then, you can head back to Aldbourne." Robert nodded and, for a moment, said nothing as he looked down at his suit. "Oh, right." Roland smiled awkwardly as he activated the release rune for the silver grace suit. His brother could finally get back into his armor. Sebastian led him outside toward the changing room while Roland followed behind and waited by the door. "So, how are things in Aldbourne? Is Finn fulfilling his duties well?" "The boy? He makes a fine squire," Robert replied while putting on his armor. The exchange felt awkward to Roland, as he was usually the quieter one in the group. Robert remained a man of few words despite all the changes he had gone through over the years. "That's good to hear. I was worried he might cause trouble for you." "He did at first. Couldn't tell the difference between an arming sword and a longsword. Handed me the wrong one during training." "Oh. That was not entirely surprising. Finn had not grown up around a noble household or trained to serve knights like most squires. He was just a commoner boy who had gained a warrior class and was now doing his best to improve. The boy has heart, though, and he learns fast." Robert stepped out of the room wearing his full suit of armor. Roland nodded and handed him his great sword, its enchantments fully repaired. "Take good care of it. I increased the output of the enchantment to match your current level." Robert accepted the great sword with both hands and gave it a testing swing. The blade cut swiftly through the air before he slid it back into its scabbard. "The weight is perfect, and the balance is better than before. You have my thanks, brother. Don't worry about it. Now go back home. Your wife is probably waiting for you." At the mention of his wife, Robert's expression softened. A moment later, he put on his helmet and, after saying his farewells, headed toward the train. The dwarven-made machine now traveled regularly between the towns, and the journey only took around an hour. There was little reason to waste energy on the teleporter, which consumed more power than an entire train carrying passengers and trade goods for an hour. The railway had only been operating for a few weeks. At first, few merchants were willing to use it, but after employing the simplest tactic of all and allowing them to ride for free, interest quickly grew. For now, the train brought in little profit, but in time, once people became dependent on the railway and the trade routes it supported, its true value would become clear. Roland stood alone for a moment after Robert left, listening to the fading sound of the workshop doors closing. The chamber had fallen quiet, but his day was far from over. Someone was still waiting for him several levels above. "She looks nervous, but I would be too." On the main monitor, he saw a figure sitting at a desk covered in parchments and books. It was his one and only disciple, Millie. Her days were spent scribing magical runic scrolls and reading skill books to help her acquire worthwhile abilities. Her level had reached 25, and now she could finally take part in her first ascension trial. "I wonder what she will be able to become." For a moment, he hesitated. He knew this was a pivotal point in the young girl's life. If she failed to obtain a suitable class, becoming his disciple in the truest sense would be difficult. Her current class, Monocolligrapher, showed considerable promise. Even without the rune prefix in its name, the class still allowed her to enchant scrolls through runic diagrams, something even monoscribes could not accomplish without learning an additional skill through a skill book or other means. At first, there had been a problem. She was unable to learn the basic rune mastery skill, a foundational ability within his repertoire. It was the same skill that had allowed Robert to attain his own class. Some form of incompatibility linked to her non-combatant class prevented her from learning it, which left him worried. Nevertheless, there was still hope, as something new had emerged once she reached her maximum level. "Are you ready, my apprentice?" He entered her private chamber, a room dedicated to scribing and study. Millie sat at a wide wooden desk, her hands hovering above a sheet of parchment already covered in half-finished rune diagrams. The room was quiet except for the faint scratching of her quill, which stopped the moment she noticed him. "Master, whoa!" She had been so absorbed in her studies that she did not notice him enter until he was standing directly behind her. She stood up too quickly and nearly knocked over the ink bottle beside her, but with quick reflexes he caught it using a simple mage hand spell. "It's fine, I've got it." Roland spoke while glancing over the parchments before turning his attention to Millie and her status. Name: Millie L25. Classes: T1 Monocalligrapher L25. Her level was now maxed out, and so were her most important skills. Basic Monocalligraphy. Active skill. Allows the user to inscribe mana-infused symbols into physical mediums to create magical enchantments. This was her core skill, the ability that allowed her to produce magical scrolls like a runic mana scribe despite lacking the proper class skill. The only issue was the immense amount of mana required, something her non-combat class struggled to provide. Ever since arriving in Albrook, she had trained this skill relentlessly, and it had finally reached its maximum level. He had also encouraged her to learn other writing-related skills, such as basic penmanship, which increased her writing speed and reduced the strain on her wrists. Producing so many scrolls each day was exhausting. Basic steady hand inscription. Passive skill. Greatly reduces hand tremors and improves precision when writing or drawing for long periods. Basic mana ink elemental infusion. Active skill. Allows the user to infuse ink with elemental magic, producing enchantments of greater elemental quality. He continued glancing through the list of skills. The elemental one was especially interesting because it allowed her to enhance the power of a spell without needing to perfectly recreate the runic structure. Finally, he focused on the thing that gave him hope. It was not a skill, but a title she had acquired after painstakingly writing thousands of scrolls. Arcane Writesmith. Title: a person with this title has poured their focus into the written word and has formed a connection to the arcane through it. The description was vague, but it hinted at untapped potential. Titles were enough to unlock special classes, and he had never heard of a writesmith before. He did not even know if such a class truly existed or if the name was simply part of the title, but it was time to find out. He was not sure how his disciple had gained this title, as he had done the same thing she had and far more. It was certainly not simply a matter of creating enchanted scrolls. Perhaps it was connected to the restrictions of her class. The description alluded to will and soul. Maybe it was only possible for someone with a restrictive class that normally would not even allow them to create a single proper magical scroll, yet she had managed to write over 1,000. "Now then, my disciple, are you ready?" Millie lowered her head and clenched her fists before looking back at him. "I am, master." She was clearly determined to go through with it, and so the time had come. He took the Ascension Trial Crystal from his side and placed it into her hand. "Then, let us move to the memory chamber." "Yes, master." Millie nodded and rose from her seat, heading toward the special room many before her had used to receive their classes more easily. The crystal was in her hand, shining brightly as it reflected the light within the chamber. She had spent countless hours reading books and practicing her scribing in this room built by her master. Life in Albrook had felt sluggish at first, even boring, as she was confined to studying and practicing her craft. Eventually, however, she found her rhythm and could not stop herself from wanting to learn more and more. She remembered her past and the guilt she felt for forcing her parents into this situation. She knew they had risked their lives in the hope that Uncle Hassan would be able to help her, but even then, her class had only held her back. At one point, she had wanted to level up just to gain a regular profession like her parents, nearly giving up on the dream of using her writing for magic. Then her new master arrived and reignited that old dream. She could finally grasp it, magical knowledge through magically written words. It was something that drove her forward, pushing her to learn more and more about the runes her teacher had mastered. Even though he was supposed to be a runesmith like her uncle, there was far more to him than met the eye. He understood magic in ways no other runesmith did, as though he had mastered both magic and crafting simultaneously. It gave her hope. If there was anyone who could guide her forward and open the world of magic to her, it would be him. "Millie." "Oh." His voice rang out beside her, and Millie nearly dropped the ascension crystal from her hand. If you're not feeling well, we can do it another day. And no, I want to do it today. Her master looked concerned at how visibly nervous she was. Remember, the trial space will present you with multiple options. If you feel the class you chose is the wrong one, you can fail on purpose, and then we can discuss it afterward. This machine will record what you see during your trial to help you pass it, so do not get discouraged if you do not complete it on your first try. Millie nodded as she leaned back in the white chair. The crystal in her hand began to glow as she finally gathered the courage to begin. This was her first time using such an item, and just as her master had described, the experience was disorienting. Everything turned white for a moment, and when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the workshop, but in a place from her recent past. It's the Red Dragon Inn. Just like everyone else, her ascension trial was shaped by memories from her past. It wasn't like this before. Previously, it was my other home. Millie was a little confused. This place looked different from the first time she had entered this space. Back then, it had not been part of the dungeon. Instead, it had taken the form of the old village where she had lived with her parents. However, her master had warned her that this could happen, so she wasn't concerned. Master told me that it usually appears as a core memory, a place closely tied to my life, and that it can change if someone's life goes through a major transformation. The inn looked exactly as she remembered it, though there were subtle differences. It seemed less worn, untouched by some of the scratches and damage left behind by drunken adventurers during their brawls. She wasn't sure why the place had changed, but it might have had something to do with her inability to change her class for so long. Her entire life had been transformed during her years in the dungeon. It had become her new home, a place she once believed she would never leave. Millie slowly stepped across the wooden floorboards of the inn. The scent of cooked meat and stale ale lingered in the air exactly as she remembered. Warm lantern light flickered across polished tables, yet something felt wrong. There were no loud adventurers or shuffling footsteps. The place felt empty. It really recreated almost everything. Even though it had not been that long, this was a place she had left behind to ascend. For a moment, she forgot this was a class-changing trial. Her thoughts drifted through old memories, both good and bad. One remained painfully vivid. It was the night she cried herself to sleep after finally accepting that she could not progress like everyone else. That memory was also what snapped her back to reality. Millie, what are you doing? This is not the time for reminiscing. I've already wasted enough time. She was already 15 years old, and most people had gone through their first ascension by that age. It was obvious she had fallen behind, and she needed to ascend at any cost. Master said these trials have a pattern to them. First, I need to find something that will lead me to the real trial. To change her class, she first needed to locate the entrance to the trial itself. She began searching the inn, starting with the main hall. She even picked up the empty ale mug scattered across the tables, but after several minutes, she still found nothing. Could it be in our room? After a while, she moved into the staff room that also served as her family's bedroom. Inside, she found her old bed along with another flood of memories, but still no clue about what she was supposed to do. How did Master call it? Process of elimination? If it's not here, then it has to be upstairs. She had learned enough from her master to know that panicking would only make her overlook something obvious. With the ground floor thoroughly searched, only the guest rooms remained. Oh, this looks different. As soon as she climbed the stairs, it became clear this was not the inn she remembered. The corridor stretched far beyond what should have been possible. The Red Dragon Inn had never possessed this many guest rooms, and stranger still, each door bore a carved symbol. This one, is that a broom and dustpan? The first door displayed a carving of cleaning tools, making her wonder if the room beyond had transformed into a storage closet. Across from it stood another door marked with cooking utensils. Wait, I know what this is. These must be classes, perhaps cleaning and cooking related ones. Millie clapped her hands together as she stared at the two doors. At last, she understood how to move forward and finally obtain a new path. So every door represents a possible class. The realization made her heartbeat quicken. If this corridor truly contained class paths, then somewhere ahead was the future she had been searching for all this time. She approached the door marked with cleaning tools and carefully touched the handle. So it won't be that easy. Nothing happened. She had not tried to push the door open. She knew entering one of these rooms would probably begin the trial, so before doing anything reckless, she followed another piece of advice her master had given her: test things first before proceeding further. She hoped for some kind of description or hint about what lay beyond the door, but even after placing her hand against the carving, nothing appeared. This might be the housekeeper class, and the other is probably cook. Before meeting her master, she would have been ecstatic to receive either of those classes. They would have helped her maintain the inn and support her mother with better cleaning and household skills. But things had changed. Now she wanted something greater for herself, something tied to magic. Master said the classes are usually arranged from the most common to the rarest. Millie paused in the middle of the corridor, her fingers still resting against the carved symbol of the cleaning tools. Slowly, she lowered her hand and looked farther down the hallway. If this truly represented possible classes, then the first doors must correspond to the most ordinary outcomes. The farther she went, the rarer and more valuable the classes would become. Her heartbeat quickened again. She stepped away from the first door and continued forward. The next door displayed a set of cooking utensils, though these carvings were far more detailed. Pots, knives, and a ladle had been etched into the surface with remarkable care. Even the wood itself looked finer and more expensive, implying this was an advanced version of the cooking class. Across from it stood a similar door marked with cleaning tools, also more refined than the earlier one. The same pattern continued as she walked onward. The doors became increasingly elaborate, and many of the classes represented were ones she had only read about before. This one is probably an accountant, so that one must be some kind of administrator, and that one, perhaps a farmer. There was a staggering number of non-combat Tier 1 classes before her, as if she had truly been given another chance at life. To her knowledge, there should not have been so many possibilities, but over the years, she had picked up countless basic skills to compensate for her own class being unable to level properly. Farther ahead, the doors no longer felt ordinary. The earlier ones had seemed simple, almost comforting in their predictability, but now she had reached the end of the corridor where she would likely need to make a choice. This one looks promising. At the very end stood a door pulsing with magical energy. Even without the mana sense of a mage, she could see it clearly. The door was forged from metal, and at its center was a quill surrounded by a strange pentagram covered in unfamiliar symbols. They were not runes, nor were they ordinary enchantments, yet they felt similar enough to leave her uneasy. Another similar door stood to the side, this one marked with a smaller quill before a magical scroll. It reminded her of her current class and was most likely a direct upgrade to it. However, the final door at the end of the corridor was far more intricate. If I fail, I can always try again. That's what Master said. Even though she felt ready for the challenge, she still feared that all her work could go to waste. More than that, she felt a strange pull toward the last door. The closer she came, the brighter the strange symbols carved into its surface glowed. After a moment, the symbols even began to move. This has to be it. But can I really get through it? One problem still followed her even in this world, her lack of mana while scribing. Although her level had increased and she was now level 25, she could only create a few basic scrolls without the aid of her bracelet. Her master had managed to obtain several skill books that improved her mana and regeneration, but their effects were limited. The stronger ones were compatible only with battle classes. Her hand settled on the door handle, and she carefully pushed it downward. The moment the latch clicked, the symbols carved into the metal door flared with light. Thin streams of pale blue energy spread across its surface like veins before the entire corridor began to tremble. Millie instinctively stepped back. The other doors lining the hallway slowly faded away. The simple wooden doors representing ordinary professions dissolved into mist one after another, leaving behind only darkness. Soon, only the final door remained. Then a tremendous force pulled her forward, and she was suddenly dragged into a completely new area. Whoa! She stumbled forward and caught herself on something soft and fuzzy. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a luxurious room resembling a nobleman's study. The carpet beneath her hands was softer than anything she had ever touched. Thick red fabric woven with golden patterns stretched across the polished floor, while towering bookshelves lined the walls from end to end. Hundreds upon hundreds of books rested upon them, each bound in leather or cloth. This place, is it some kind of library? The sheer number of books was overwhelming, but as she looked ahead, she noticed a lone desk standing in the middle of the room. A strange quill rested upon it beside several crystal ink bottles filled with shimmering liquid that shifted colors every few seconds. Millie slowly stood and brushed off her dress even though there was no dust on it. The room felt pristine, untouched by time itself. Not a single sheet of parchment was out of place. The bookshelves stretched so high that she could not even see where they ended. Above them was only darkness. So this is my trial? This looks similar to Master's first trial. Her teacher had once told her about his own first trial, the one that made him a mana scribe. He had been tasked with creating a magical scroll within a strict time limit. However, this trial already felt far more serious. As she stepped closer to the desk, she noticed a massive book resting on the left side and a neat stack of parchments placed on the right. What does it want me to do here, exactly? She approached the desk cautiously. The strange quill resting upon it looked nothing like the feather pens she used at the workshop. Its shaft appeared to be crafted from silver metal intertwined with crystal veins that pulsed faintly with mana. The tip glimmered with blue light, as though waiting for her touch. The large book beside it suddenly opened on its own. Millie jumped slightly as the thick pages began turning rapidly. Lines of text flashed past too quickly to read before finally stopping near the center. The moment the pages settled, glowing words appeared across the parchment. Recreate the presented magical formula using the provided tools. Failure to complete the formula within the allotted time will result in failure. Below the message, another page slowly revealed itself. Upon it was an intricate magical pattern unlike anything she had ever seen before. What is that? Her eyes widened. It did not resemble the runes she had seen before, though there were faint similarities. The lines curved with impossible precision, intersecting one another in ways that made her head spin. Beyond the runic symbols, she noticed something entirely new. Magical circles were woven into the structure, tying everything together in ways runes never did. It was something she had never studied before. This is... Can you connect things in such a way? She had spent months studying rune structures under her master, enough to understand that magical formulas always followed an internal logic. Mana needed pathways. Enchantments required anchors. Effects had to be stabilized through balancing points. This strange diagram obeyed similar principles, but its methods felt foreign and unorthodox. There was something more than mana flowing through it, yet she could still sense the same power emanating from the ink bottles resting nearby. So this is it. The task lay before her, and a moment later she heard something click. Turning toward the sound, she spotted a large hourglass. Sand had already begun to fall. Pale white grains streamed steadily downward, marking the passage of time. By the size of this hourglass, I should have a few hours for this. I'd better start. Millie clenched her fists as she looked from the diagram to the bottles of magical ink and the quill. The moment her fingers wrapped around the silver shaft, a sharp pulse of mana traveled through her arm. It was not painful, but it startled her enough that she almost dropped it. The crystal veins embedded within the pen brightened in response to her touch. It reacted to me, and this feeling. It's kind of refreshing. The bottles of ink beside the desk shimmered in various colors as she slowly dipped the quill into one of them. The moment the tip touched the liquid, faint ripples of mana spread across the surface. The ink almost seemed alive as strands of glowing energy climbed upward into the pen itself. It's absorbing it. The sensation reminded her of the enchanted scrolls she created with her master, except far stronger. Usually, she needed to carefully guide every bit of mana into the ink herself, which was the reason she had always struggled with proper scribing. But this pen drew the mana naturally, functioning much like the bracelet her master had made for her. This, perhaps with this. Her eyes widened as she felt the magic flowing through the tool in her hand. Slowly, she guided the pen to the parchment, and her hand began to move just as it had countless times before. Copying runic diagrams was something she did daily. She had written countless practice scrolls since childhood, even using ordinary pencils to train when she lacked the mana required to create true magical scrolls. I can do this, she muttered to herself while sweat beaded across her forehead. The moment the quill touched the parchment, the glowing ink resisted her. The line she tried to draw twisted slightly to the side before snapping back violently, ruining the pattern. What? Her eyes shot open as her first attempt failed. While her limited mana did not seem to matter within this trial, the ink moved on its own as though it were alive and fighting her for control. So, this is the true trial, controlling the ink. Millie nodded and tossed the ruined parchment aside. Even though she had already failed once, there was still time. Even if it took 100 attempts, she would succeed. She would make her parents and her master proud for believing in her and giving her this chance. Failure was not an option. Soon, the study was filled with the scratching of the quill and the sound of crumpled paper hitting the floor. That's an interesting quill. She chose well out of all the options, but what exactly is this class? Roland glanced at the screen as the slideshow began to play. This was an upgraded model of the Ascension trial memory device. The images were much clearer now and appeared at shorter intervals. During shorter trials, the memories were also condensed, giving him a better overview of the entire space. His apprentice was performing some kind of scribing skill, unlike those used by mana scribes or runic mana scribes. The magic itself seemed different, yet strangely familiar. It still involved runes to some extent, but something else was woven into it, a different kind of logic, as if the runic language itself had been altered. Is this some sort of specialized magical language, or is it because this isn't a combat class? Normally, Millie was incapable of producing even a single magic scroll due to her lack of mana. Only after he created the bracelet was she able to progress. It was something that should not have been possible under normal circumstances, yet she had managed it. She would never have been able to attempt a standard ascension trial otherwise. However, the class she was pursuing now appeared to function differently. The mana did not seem to come from her directly, but instead from the special ink and the quill she was using. Maybe the bracelet won't be as necessary anymore, but the ink will be. Creating a bracelet capable of supplying his apprentice with mana was a simple task for him. A few runes placed in the right spots, and the work was done. Magical ink, however, was outside his area of expertise. Fortunately, he had an alchemist working for him. As for that quill, I should be able to figure it out once I see her new skill in action. The classes Millie kept obtaining were far from ordinary and seemed to require considerable outside assistance to function properly. Still, until she completed the trial successfully, he could not be certain of anything. The memories aren't fading, which means the device was designed to preserve information from ascension trials so that future candidates could prepare more effectively. Normally, failed attempts resulted in memory loss, necessitating the memory restoration feature. However, if someone passed the trial, there would be no memory erasure and no need to activate the recovery function. Millie's eyes slowly opened, her vision blurred as though she had awakened from an exhausting dream. A dull ache lingered behind her eyes, and for a brief moment, she forgot where she was. Her gaze drifted toward the ceiling above her as it gradually came into focus. Then she noticed her master standing nearby. Master? Then that means. Yes, you did it. Rest for a moment. The first time is always disorienting. He replied while checking her vitals. Non-combat classes usually made ascension trials easier on those undertaking them. There were no dramatic stat increases to alter the body, nor overwhelming skills that strained the mind and spirit. Most people gained simple classes that were easy to adapt to. However, in Millie's case, the class she had obtained seemed far more unusual. This class, the name hasn't changed much, but... Name. Millie L26. Classes. T1 Mana Calligrapher L25. T1 Arcane Calligrapher L1. Tier 1 classes usually followed a simpler naming pattern, so it was not surprising that the new class lacked some grand title and was instead presented as a variation of the original. Even so, it hinted at the future ahead of them and made it clear that the next Tier 2 class would revolve around arcane magic. Some people used magic and arcane interchangeably, but they were different forms of energy, much like the many others he had already analyzed. One advantage of arcane magic was that it consumed less mana. The downside, however, was that it required extensive preparation to complete the formulas properly. A single mistake could cause the entire arcane structure to collapse or create a completely unintended effect. It was a far more unstable form of magic that demanded precise chanting along with numerous supporting items. Fast casting was especially difficult and carried a much higher chance of failure. However, once the spell took shape, the resulting effect was usually stronger than regular magic or enchantments. Arcane Calligrapher. Class. Allows the user to sense arcane energies and use them for arcane calligraphy. He began reading through her status to see what she had gained. The first thing listed was the Arcane Calligrapher class and, as expected, it was not a combat class and lacked the stat bonuses such classes usually provided. A mage class, for instance, came with increases to mana capacity and mana regeneration. This one, on the other hand, only seemed to grant something similar to the mana sense skill that mages typically received. There was no separate skill listed for it, clearly indicating that the class itself fulfilled that role. Interesting. Arcane Penmanship. Active skill. Allows the arcane calligrapher to shape arcane energies into words of power. This was clearly the core skill of the class, the ability that allowed Millie to create arcane enchantments. However, it was not the only skill she had gained. Arcane ink infusion. Active skill. Allows the arcane calligrapher to infuse ink with arcane energies. This was about all the skills she had received. The workflow itself seemed rather simple. She would need to infuse magical ink with arcane energy using the arcane ink infusion skill, then use arcane penmanship to transfer it onto paper. This would likely be her work for the next 25 levels, and he would need to figure out how to help her perform it efficiently. She is going to have to be very precise in her work from now on. Roland nodded as he activated the seat, straightening it to help her sit upright. Once the dizziness passed, he finally began asking her a few questions. "How do you feel?" Roland asked as he handed her a small glass of water. Millie accepted it with both hands. Her fingers still trembled slightly from exhaustion. After taking a few careful sips, she looked back at him. "Tired, but also strange. It feels like my head is full of things I don't completely understand yet." That is normal after acquiring a new class, especially one tied to knowledge-based skills. Once you start using those skills and reinforcing what you learned, it should become easier to understand. His expression remained calm, though inwardly he was far more curious than he let on. The memory images from the trial had already revealed enough to confirm his suspicions. Arcane formulas were different from the ordinary runes he specialized in, yet somehow Millie had managed to complete the trial despite having no prior exposure to them. What interested him even more was whether this calligraphic skill was limited to paper or if it could be expanded further. The ability to create magical scrolls was already useful, and he had perfected the craft by making miniature versions no larger than a playing card. That was something he could teach her, but perhaps there was more to this arcane class than met the eye. So, how was it? How was it? Oh. At first, he wondered if he should call for her parents to help her home, but the moment he mentioned the trial, Millie's eyes widened. "It was really strange, Master, but I listened to all your advice." Millie straightened slightly in the white chair despite her exhaustion. The earlier dizziness had already begun to fade, replaced by excitement bubbling beneath the surface. Her trembling hands tightened around the small glass of water as she started speaking with far more enthusiasm. "It really looked like something from my old memories. It was the Red Dragon Inn, just like you predicted. I spent so much time looking for the actual trial master. It was so nerve-wracking." The more she spoke, the more excited she became. He was not sure if this was simply her teenage side showing through, as she was usually energetic even under normal circumstances. "And then I found the door at the end, and inside it was." "I see." Roland did not interrupt her. He allowed her to continue as her eyes nearly sparkled with excitement. It was obvious she was proud of passing the trial on her first attempt and eager to tell her master everything. She described the experience from beginning to end while he listened carefully, making sure she was truly all right. And then I almost failed, but I managed to fix it just before the last grain of sand fell." "Oh? And what was the spell within that arcane scroll you created?" "The spell within the scroll?" Millie blinked twice, clearly caught off guard by the question. During all her excited rambling, she had not even stopped to think about what she had actually created. Her brows furrowed as she tried to recall the final moments of the trial. "I don't know." "You don't know?" Roland raised an eyebrow. That answer alone was unusual. Most Ascension trials ended with the creation of a simple spell or item that reflected the class itself. The user normally understood at least its basic function instinctively after succeeding. It started to flash, then the whole room turned white, and after that I woke up here. Interesting. Maybe it was just a simple light spell. Roland pondered the possibility. It was not entirely unreasonable. When he became a runic mana scribe, he had only needed to create a scroll containing a glowing orb spell before his class change. "Oh, why don't I just do it now? I still remember it clearly. Maybe I should do it before I forget." Millie suddenly jumped off the chair and pointed toward the exit for some reason. "I don't think that's a good idea. How about we continue tomorrow? There are still a few things we need to prepare, like the special ink." Roland shook his head. He did not want the girl to overwork herself. She was clearly excited after performing so well, but he still was not fully prepared. Some of the key ingredients for the magic ink and quill were still missing. He already had an idea of what to do, but gathering the materials and speaking with Rastix would be necessary first. "Oh, really? But Master, what if I just tried it once? It's fine. We'll do it tomorrow. For now, go back to your parents and tell them the good news. We'll continue in the morning. Right. I need to tell Mama and Papa. The moment Millie heard her parents mentioned, her eyes began to sparkle again. She nearly spilled the water in her hand before quickly gulping it down. I need to show them my status right away, but. Just use the glasses I gave you. They'll be able to see it. Roland replied as Millie stood up and nodded with a bright smile. She turned around and started running toward the door, but just before reaching it, she stopped. Roland tilted his head in confusion as the girl looked back at him, then suddenly rushed toward him again. Without warning, she wrapped him in a big hug. Thank you, Master. I'll never forget what you've done for me. Never in a million years. Roland felt slightly awkward being hugged by his new disciple like this. His arms lingered awkwardly in the air for a moment before one hand finally settled against her shoulder in a gentle pat. It was a timid gesture on his part, but Millie held nothing back, smiling brightly as she embraced him. There is no need to be so dramatic. You earned this yourself. No way. I never could have done any of this without you. Millie pulled back just enough to look at him directly. Her face was flushed bright red from excitement, but there was also genuine emotion in her eyes. If you hadn't helped me, Master, I would still be stuck at the inn, folding blankets and cleaning tables forever. There is nothing wrong with honest work. He replied while rubbing his neck awkwardly as the girl refused to let him go. I know that. But now I can do more than that. For a brief moment, Roland saw something different in her expression. It was not just excitement over gaining a new class. It was hope. Real hope for a future she had long believed was impossible. The sight made him pause. People in this world rarely escape the path their class forced upon them. A bad class at the beginning often meant a limited future forever. He had already seen enough examples to understand how cruel the system could be. Millie had been another victim of it until now. Yet somehow, through persistence, luck, and perhaps a little interference from someone who did not belong in this world, she had managed to break free from that predetermined path. You should go before your parents start thinking something exploded in here. Millie laughed sheepishly and finally let go of him. Right. She hurried toward the door again, but stopped halfway and turned around once more. Master. What is it now? Her smile softened slightly, and she spoke with a grin. I'll work really hard from now on. Roland nodded and smirked. I expect nothing less. Now get a good night's rest, because tomorrow you'll have a lot of work waiting for you. That seemed to satisfy her. She gave him one final energetic nod before rushing out of the room. A second later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor outside, followed by the elevator doors opening to carry her upstairs. I suppose I'll need to live up to the expectations of my eager disciple then. It was clear that Millie was eager to learn and level up even further. He was there to guide her, but the problem remained. He was not an arcane calligrapher, nor did he possess any books related to the class. It was entirely up to him to do the research and set her on the right path. Sebastian. Yes, Master. Inform Rastix that I'll be at his lab shortly, and make sure not to startle him, or he might blow something up again like last time. Yes, Master. The disembodied voice of his assistant echoed through the workshop as Roland made his way toward the elevator. He still had other work to do, but he made sure to spend both this day and the next in Albrook. Over the rest of the day, he began making preparations. As always, Rastix had left his laboratory in a complete mess, with alchemical reagents scattered everywhere, but creating Tier 1 magical ink was not particularly difficult for him. Roland possessed knowledge of many different variations, including some that incorporated arcane magic, so he left Rastix to prepare several ink bottles for him. Of course, he had to promise him more rare materials to experiment with afterward, but that was a small price to pay. Then, it was up to him to create the instrument his student would one day use. Scribes typically relied on quills, but that did not mean he could not create something better, such as a metal fountain pen capable of holding runes. He continued his work, researching and building, though he never neglected his main project, the mobile runic armor. Millie was becoming an important part of his life, but there were still other priorities. Half a year had already passed, and he needed to travel to the institute to check on the students who would participate in the upcoming competitions. So much to do and not enough time for any of it. I could really use a machine that slows time itself. He grumbled as he examined the metallic pen he had created. The object in his hand was unlike the feathered quills commonly used by scribes. Its body had been forged from a silvery metal, polished smooth, and reinforced with thin internal channels designed to carry enchanted ink. Tiny runes had already been etched beneath the outer casing, each one linked through delicate traces, though the system was not yet fully customized. The arcane energies his student would wield first needed to be studied before he could fully commit to the design. This should be enough to survive a Tier 1 arcane energy discharge, I think. Although he had extensive experience in the field, accidents were always possible. At least during the first test, he needed to remain nearby in case a volatile explosion injured her fingers. With most of the work complete, he returned to the golem intended for the competition. Even though 6 months still remained, time would pass quickly. He needed to ensure victory if he wished to finally earn his freedom. Now then, try it again. I adjusted the pen to better handle arcane energies. Master really can do anything. Ah. I'm not so sure about that. Roland shook his head when he saw Millie's eyes sparkling again. The two were testing her new class inside the workshop. They were currently in the room his apprentice used for studying, which would likely become the main place where she practiced this craft. Sheets of reinforced parchment had already been stacked neatly beside Millie, along with several small bottles of shimmering dark blue ink. The metallic pen Roland had created rested in his hands. The runes engraved across its surface still shimmered faintly as he performed some final runesmithing adjustments to attune it to the arcane energies she was using. It looked rather simple at first glance, but beneath the polished silver casing were dozens of miniature runes designed to stabilize the arcane flow. The nib itself had been forged from dwarven steel mixed with etherium to improve mana conduction. Still, be careful. Arcane energy is far more unstable than regular mana. Of course, Master. Don't worry. Millie carefully accepted the pen from his hands as though she had just been entrusted with a priceless artifact. The silver surface reflected the workshop lights faintly while the tiny runes hidden beneath the casing pulsed with a soft glow. It feels heavier compared to the old quill. I've never seen one like this before. You'll get used to it in no time. For now, try to infuse the magical ink with arcane energy, then we can move on to the next step. I'll give it my all, Master. Millie nodded seriously. Unlike yesterday's excitement, she now looked completely focused. Roland stepped back from the desk and crossed his arms while observing her carefully. The workshop had been prepared in advance for this experiment. Several layered barriers shimmered faintly along the walls beneath engraved metal plates. If the arcane energies spiraled out of control, the resulting explosion would at least remain contained within the room. Roland was also there to protect Millie if anything went haywire. Let's start with the ink bottle first. Try using your arcane ink infusion skill on the vial. There isn't much ink inside, but still be careful. Your bracelet will help compensate for any mana loss. Here I go, Master. She picked up the small container of liquid. Though it resembled glass, it was made from a far more durable material. Roland had no intention of risking it shattering and injuring his apprentice. The moment Millie activated her skill, the ink inside the vial reacted. A faint blue glow spread through the liquid. The ink itself was pitch black, making it appear as though tiny blue veins of mana were coursing through it. However, something soon happened that caused Roland's brow to rise. The color of the energy shifted from blue to purple, and the vial began glowing red. There is a clear increase in heat and... He glanced at Millie's status, focusing mainly on her MP. It was dropping rapidly, to the point that her bracelet had to compensate for the loss. Under normal circumstances, she would have already run out of mana, which made him suspect this was not the intended use of her new skill. Then there was the heat produced by the concentrated mana, which would have caused a normal vial to burst long ago. That's enough, Millie. Stop for now. Millie was still holding the vial in one hand, and the moment he told her to stop, she obeyed. It was clear that the girl was exhausted. Even though the bracelet compensated for the lost mana, the skill was far more taxing than regular mana calligraphy. It seems that infusing the ink inside the bottle might not be possible, at least not for now. Instead, we'll try using the pen directly. He picked the pen up from where Millie had set it down and showed her how to insert the vial into the side of the fountain pen. The cylindrical chamber clicked softly into place beneath the casing once secured. This compartment acts as both a reservoir and a regulator. The runes inside distribute the mana more evenly before it reaches the nib and, once it does, infuse it with arcane energy. After that, the ink flows through the smaller channels before reaching the tip through the final slit. At that point, you'll probably need to activate your other skill, arcane penmanship to guide the arcane-infused ink through the paper. Millie continued nodding as he explained the process, and soon they attempted it a second time. Now her main task was to infuse the ink once it reached the nib at the end of the pen. The moment Millie activated the skill again, the runes hidden within the pen responded immediately. A faint silver light spread across the metallic casing while the dark ink inside the reservoir began to swirl and react. Just as Roland had instructed, the process continued, and this time it worked far better than before. Instead of violently heating the entire vial at once, the arcane energy was infused while the ink traveled through the pen's channels. With a much smaller amount of liquid to handle, the process became easier for Millie, and after a few tries, the pen finally responded. Master, something is happening. Millie shouted as she saw a faint purplish aura forming around the pen tip. The silver metal trembled softly in her grasp while the ink inside glowed with streaks of deep violet light. The ink has absorbed the arcane energy. You should be able to put it on paper now. Why don't you try one of the easier runes first? Roland instructed her to attempt one of the old enchantments she already knew. Curious about what would happen if she tried creating a runic structure with the altered ink, he watched closely as she obeyed. Right, here I go. Just as advised, she began slowly. Arcane penmanship guided her hand across the paper. The signs of arcane mana were unmistakable as the ink glowed purple and pulsed like living veins. Yet Roland immediately noticed that something was wrong. The moment she completed the structure, the glow faded almost instantly, and all the energy he had sensed moments before vanished. Failure. I'm sorry, Master, let me try again. You did well, Millie. It's not really your fault. The rune structure itself needs adjustments to function properly. Roland's multiple minds quickly worked through what had just happened. The spell he had created was quite simple, only a magical light meant to shine above the scroll once activated. However, the moment arcane energy was introduced, the runes stopped functioning correctly. The mana density was far higher than usual, and it seemed to clog both the traces and the runic structures themselves. For this to work, he would need to adapt the design to the new magical wavelength and make multiple adjustments. How about you try recreating the spell you learned during the Ascension trial? That one? Sure, I have it right here, Master. Millie pointed to the notebook resting on the table. Inside was a sketch of the arcane enchantment she had used during the trial. It looked like a fusion of runic language and magical circles. The usual runic traces had been replaced with circular formations along with several unfamiliar components. Roland watched as his apprentice carefully recreated the drawing. Earlier, he had intended her to fail the first rune so he could observe how the arcane energy reacted to it. Now that he could study the correct structure properly, he finally understood why the previous rune had collapsed. As Millie continued, he also began to grasp the underlying logic and how the runes could be adapted accordingly. Interesting. The construct looked unstable, yet he could feel the magic within it surpassing what a Tier 1 spell scroll should normally contain. It was far more potent than the runic scrolls he had learned to scribe at the beginning. The destructive potential of arcane spells is well known, and this is why. The moment the scroll was completed, it activated on its own. Just as Millie had described earlier, a brilliant flash erupted from the center of the parchment. During her trial, she had only seen the blinding light at the very end, but now Roland witnessed it himself. The spell was some form of light magic, intense enough to flood the room with brilliant white radiance for several seconds. Roland quickly covered both his own eyes and Millie's before the glare could blind them. Quite the light show. Wait, was that it? Millie peeked out from beneath Roland's hand, staring at the burnt page she had just finished. The ink had burst apart the moment the spell activated, revealing yet another flaw in this style of scribing. That's not a bad start, but you'll need to work on your finishing technique. The scroll shouldn't activate so easily on its own. Millie lowered the smoking parchment and stared at the charred center in disbelief. But it worked, didn't it? It did. Roland stepped closer and picked up the ruined sheet before the remaining ash could crumble across the desk. Despite the spreading burn marks, parts of the circular arcane structure were still visible. Thin traces of violet energy lingered for a moment before fading completely. The spell formation itself succeeded. The problem lies in its stability and spell grade. Grade? She looked up at him, and he nodded. Yes. It simply means you need more practice. Start by creating a stable version of this spell first. I can do that. Millie was already brimming with energy and eager to continue. Roland did not stop her, though he did hand her a pair of protective glasses to shield her eyes from the blinding flashes. The spell was stable enough that she could work alone, but he still instructed Sebastian to keep watch while he turned his attention to another matter. I need to convert some of the runic spells and figure out the logic behind their components. It was all too similar to when he had become a runic mana scribe. Back then, he had used his debugging skill to steal various runic enchantments and catalog their components into groups. He could do the same here by reverse engineering the initial spell Millie had created. His true runic sight skill had already helped him transform the arcane enchantment into a runic one, and with both versions in mind, he could begin deducing how everything worked. Thankfully, this was only a Tier 1 enchantment, something he could analyze rather quickly. When he had been a Tier 1 class holder himself, it had taken him half a year to figure out which component did what, but after that, his runic creation skills had soared. What she needs are a few simple spells to help her get used to arcane energies. While his student worked, he started devising a way to repurpose simple runic enchantments into arcane ones. She had no way of creating new spells without blindly experimenting on her own. Neither did he know of any place that stored such magical enchantments, but there were ordinary arcane magicians out there, along with books detailing their spells and techniques. From what he knew, there had once been people who crafted arcane scrolls. However, they were quickly overshadowed by regular enchanted scrolls and runic ones. Arcane scrolls were simply too unstable to be practical for monster hunting, so the craft gradually faded away as people turned to more reliable forms of magic. In the end, raw power meant little if it could not be used effectively. For the rest of the day, he worked on a system for his apprentice. It consumed much of his time, but after several hours, he finally managed to crack the code. Once he understood the underlying structure, it became much easier to transcribe old runic spell schematics and create a simple study guide for her. By the time evening arrived, Millie had already burned through an entire stack of reinforced parchment. The room smelled faintly of scorched paper and magical smoke. Thin curls of smoke still drifted upward from her latest failed attempt when Roland entered carrying a notebook. That should be enough for now. Go through these notes, and you can try again tomorrow. I think I'm starting to get the hang of this, Master. Millie sounded somewhat disappointed, as most of her attempts had ended in failure. Even so, while she only gained experience from successfully completing a scroll, her skill levels still improved through repeated arcane calligraphy practice. You're improving, but don't get ahead of yourself. Study the material in the notebook first, then try again. Yes, Master. With that, Millie headed home. 2 guards waited for her outside to escort her back, and Roland finally had time to focus on other matters. When I'm at the institute, I should go through the library and gather everything I can on arcane magic. He had been postponing the visit for quite some time, wanting to make the most of his days in Albrook, especially since the headmistress no longer asked him to lecture there regularly. Still, the time had finally come for him to return and deal with the teenage students again. After eating dinner and spending some more time working on the mobile armor, he went to bed beside his wife. Early the next morning, he handed Millie another notebook to study. I might not be able to come here as often anymore, so if you don't see me in the workshop, ask Sebastian for advice. Oh? Where are you going, Master? Millie stretched and rubbed her eyes as she spoke. Her gaze had already been fixed on the notebook, but the moment he mentioned where he was headed, her attention snapped to him almost instantly. For now, I'm heading to Xandar's Institute of Wizardry through the gate. After that, I have a few other matters to attend to. There were 2 main things he wanted to take care of. One was finishing the large golem for the competition, and the other was helping both himself and Agni grow stronger. However, he still needed to create several magical items for other students, which would likely take a few more days. Xandar's Institute of Wizardry, that sounds like a magic school. Ah, yes, it is. His assistant, who had been focused on her work moments ago, now seemed completely captivated by the idea. The fascination was written plainly across her face. He had no intention of bringing her along since she would probably slow him down, but it was also a place where she could learn a great deal through the library alone. While he could always create guides and notebooks that got straight to the point, there were benefits to broadening one's knowledge through reading. Titles could be gained that way, and the mind was much like a muscle. The more information it absorbed, the stronger it became. Perhaps if you work hard enough, I'll show you the institute library. Really? She nearly jumped from her seat in excitement, and he immediately regretted saying it. The promise had already been made, though in truth, it would probably be good for her to experience the world of magic and meet mentors like Arian. Yes, of course. I'll need to ask if your parents are comfortable with it. We would be traveling through the gate into the kingdom proper. Oh, I'm sure Mama and Papa will agree. I'll make certain of it. Roland could only sigh as he watched her enthusiasm rise once again. She already looked ready to drag her parents to the gate herself if necessary. Do not pressure them too much. Allowing their daughter to travel alone into the kingdom is no small matter. Anything could happen. I know, but I also know I can count on you, Master. Is that so? Roland was not entirely sure where her confidence came from, but if he ever decided to take her along, he would need to live up to it. Traveling alone was one thing. Bringing his disciple with him was another entirely. Constructing a few Tier 3 golemic defenders for her protection might be a good idea. With those schematics I received from Master Hassim, it should not be too difficult, but first. With that, the two parted ways, and he headed toward the teleportation gate in his workshop. The trip had become routine after so many journeys, and the discomfort he once felt around the students there had almost disappeared. Even so, he still paused for a moment to gather himself before stepping through. His introverted tendencies had not vanished completely, but he understood that this was necessary. On the other side, he was greeted by the familiar magician and one of his closest allies, Arian the Rune Mage. My friend, you are here. It feels as though we have not spoken in ages. In person, perhaps, so, how are things? Have the students gathered? They are gathering as we speak. Why don't we head over and see what the Institute's brightest young minds are like? Roland needed to determine which students were best suited for which runic aid devices. There would be many candidates, and some would benefit more than others. Those decisions would ultimately fall to him and Arian. Soon, the two moved through the halls together, one armored man and a floating black cat at his side. The place seems busier than usual. Roland commented as he noticed far more activity than normal throughout the institute. Students filled nearly every corridor. Some hurried between classrooms carrying stacks of books, while others gathered in small groups, speaking excitedly among themselves. Even several instructors seemed unusually occupied, moving from one wing of the building to another with documents tucked beneath their arms. Others, however, appeared different. They were not busy at all, just unusually cheerful as they wandered about carrying spatial bags and backpacks. Of course it is. The exams have ended, and you know what that means. Ah. It's like that. Roland had not been at the school for very long and had been too busy to pay much attention to the students and their lives. Most of the exams were over, which meant the students finally had some free time for themselves. Those who had not passed still needed to take supplementary examinations, but judging by the atmosphere, most had already escaped that fate. They seem awfully excited. Wouldn't you be? They get to see their families and relax. Others will be allowed to venture outside and take on jobs with adventurers. It's a big step toward becoming adults. Arian floated beside Roland in his black cat form. His tail swayed lazily as the two observed the students. Their faces were filled with anticipation and excitement. Some spoke about returning home for the holidays, while others compared plans for dungeon expeditions and temporary work contracts. Roland even overheard a group discussing which adventuring parties were recruiting apprentice mages this season. The sight reminded him of when his brother Robert had arrived in Albrook with the woman who later became his wife. They had participated in a joint expedition between a magic academy and a knight academy. Some of the students here were now at that same age and would soon be leaving for several months on similar missions. They would gain valuable experience and earn merit points in the process. It was not just about gaining combat experience in the field. These expeditions also gave them the opportunity to forge connections with promising young knights. Some mages hoped to become tutors for noble families or enter their service directly. Others dreamed of joining the mage towers of powerful Tier 3 mages, while some wished to remain at the institute and teach future generations of students. A lot of new students are running around as well. You should perhaps change the scheduling. Arian laughed as Roland pointed out the chaos in the halls. Ah, perhaps we should. His voice remained light as his floating black cat form tilted in midair, tail curling lazily behind him. Though if we changed the schedule now, I suspect half the faculty would start complaining. Everyone is already used to it. Roland grumbled quietly. The institute's schedule had always struck him as inefficient. Mages were an odd bunch. Instead of spreading their workload more evenly, they tended to cram everything into a handful of particularly busy days. They seemed to prefer working intensely for short periods rather than maintaining a steady pace. For Roland, who was constantly working anyway, this was not much of a problem. However, when ordinary people who were not accustomed to such a demanding rhythm tried to keep up, mistakes were almost inevitable. He could already see confused new students getting lost in the halls and teachers rushing around with various lists, trying to find them and guide them to the correct dorms. To make matters worse, the corridors had not been designed to handle this much traffic at once. Groups of students struggled to squeeze past one another in the narrower passages, while upperclassmen carried oversized luggage enchanted to hover just above the ground. One such piece of luggage was suddenly launched into the air when a rushing student accidentally kicked it, forcing Roland to catch it with his mage hand spell. "Don't run in the halls!" His voice echoed through the corridor, amplified by magic. The moment he spoke, everyone stopped and turned to look at him. "It's the full mithril enforcer." "You idiot, he's the full mithril deputy now." "Oh, right." The students whispered among themselves while staring at his armored figure. He was wearing the same suit of armor he usually used here, though he could switch to one of his other sets whenever he wished. Since arriving at the academy, he had become somewhat infamous, earning scorn from some and respect from others. As far as he knew, many students feared him. Rumors had spread about him fighting knights and even killing people. "Haha, you're as famous as ever, Deputy Professor Wayland." Arian laughed, and the moment he spoke, the corridor grew even quieter. The students began moving more cautiously, and many stepped to the sides of the hallway. It was clear they were waiting for him to pass before continuing on their way. "Sure. Well, this isn't so bad. At least they won't bother me if they're afraid of me." His reputation did have its advantages. The peace and quiet it brought was one of them. With a single sentence, he had silenced the crowd and cleared a path through the corridor. As he walked away, he could already hear the noise returning behind him. Some students even cast silencing spells to avoid being overheard, but he could still catch snippets of their conversations. Some were relieved he was gone, while others wondered where he was headed. "So, Professor Arian, the examinations are over, and since you called for me, I assume the initial selection process has been completed." "That's right." Arian nodded, and Roland quickly moved on to another matter. "Have you prepared that as I asked?" "By that, you mean?" Arian's tail wiggled slightly before he pointed a paw at Roland and traced a strange shape in the air that resembled a rune. "Yes, that. We'll need it for the secondary selection process." "Indeed. Don't worry, everything has been prepared, and all the students should have gathered by now." "Good." Roland nodded. He had arranged something that would help him determine the most suitable equipment for the students. The competition between the schools did not involve only the younger participants. Some events, such as the golem competition, were contested by entire departments. Low-level mages could not truly create golems. At best, they could summon magical constructs that resembled them. The competition was a mix of youths competing against other youths with the guidance of their teachers. However, the teachers also had several ways to compete against one another, and Roland would need to find ways to help his side secure victory and achieve a strong ranking. Roland followed Arian through the corridor, the noise of the institute gradually fading as they moved toward the central hall. The structure resembled a modern gymnasium and was usually used for magical training and even battles between young magicians. Inside were numerous magical circles capable of producing barriers for the students. Some served as demonstration platforms where students could perform tests of magical control. There were even loops suspended from the ceiling through which young magicians had to guide a ball of mana. The faster they completed the correct course, the better their control score and final grade. "So these are the students. There are quite a lot of them." When he arrived, the full scale of the central hall was revealed before him. Multiple rows of students filled the space. Some were chatting, others sat in chairs, and a few floated around on strange soap bubbles created by someone with a liking for whimsical magic. If this had been his first time interacting with magicians, he might have been surprised. At this point, however, he had seen more than his fair share of oddities. "Everyone, could we have your attention?" Fortunately, he could rely on Arian to address the young magicians instead of doing it himself. The dwarven craftsmen and several assistant professors from the runic department were also present. The department now had more personnel, better equipment and a budget worthy of a proper academic division, and it showed. The device Roland intended to install here was something he had designed long ago for the protection of Albrook. It was a scanner capable of recording a person's mana signature, class, and various other attributes before storing the information in the city database. Originally, it had been used to track individuals and identify potential spies. Today, however, it would serve a different purpose. It would record each student's capabilities, allowing the department to later create runic accessories tailored to their specific strengths. In 6 months, these students would participate in a variety of competitions. They were already among the best in their classes, but many had not yet committed themselves to a particular discipline. Roland and Arian had the opportunity to influence those choices, and the scanner would help determine which students were best suited for each event. With the right assignments, they could significantly improve their chances of victory. Welcome, young mages of Xandar's Institute of Wizardry. Today marks the secondary selection phase for the upcoming inter-academy competitions. A ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. Some students leaned forward, others straightened their posture, and a few exchanged nervous glances. They had all earned their place through tests and accomplishments accumulated throughout the year. Now came another stage of the selection process, one that would determine which competitions they would enter. While students could still decline participation if they were unhappy with their assigned role, such cases were rare. Taking part in the games between magical academies was both prestigious and highly sought after. It was an opportunity to showcase everything they had learned and bring pride not only to their professors but also to their families. Winners would receive special privileges, along with trophies and distinctions that could later help them secure desirable positions in institutions such as the Royal Magical Court. I'm sure you all have your preferred events, but what matters now is disposition and alignment. Arian the Rune Mage continued, his floating black cat form drifting a little higher as his voice carried clearly across the hall. Your performance throughout the year has already been recorded, and your grades will be taken into account. However, today you will need to take one final test to measure your true inclinations. He finally turned toward what the dwarven craftsmen were assembling. The magical scanner looked quite intricate, with numerous thick cables feeding into a central runic core. The structure was circular, almost like a gate laid flat against the ground, with runic channels carved along its outer ring. Each channel pulsed faintly as mana flowed through it in controlled waves. And here we have the device that will make today's selection possible. Arian said, gesturing with one paw. A runic status and resonance scanner, designed in cooperation with Deputy Professor Wayland and the Runic Department. A few students whispered at the mention of Roland's title. Some leaned forward with sudden interest, while others looked nervous, as though the machine itself might harm them. Some of them look like they think it will hurt them. What kind of rumors have they been spreading about me? He could tell that a few of the younger female students were afraid to meet his gaze and hid behind the male students nearby. There was little he could do besides feel annoyed. Soon, he spread out his senses to gauge the capabilities of this latest batch of youths. There's a mix of Tier 1 and Tier 2 students. Hey! There were a lot of people gathered here, so he had not paid much attention to any one individual. Some students were still arriving, and one of them immediately caught his eye. A lone girl with golden blonde hair and green eyes entered through one of the doors. She looked somewhat confused but quickly took a place behind the other students gathered there. Did she somehow manage to get in? It was Lucienne, Roland's youngest sister. She had returned to the institute not long ago after being absent for several months. He had not expected her to perform particularly well during the exams, considering how much material she had missed. Yet somehow, she was here, ready to participate in the final stage of the selection process. Now then, why don't we proceed in alphabetical order, starting with the oldest students and ending with the youngest? Once your name is called, please step through. Arian continued speaking before calling out the first student by name. The young man stepped forward with visible confidence, adjusted his robes, and entered the circular platform as instructed. Roland pulled his attention away from his sister, who still seemed intent on avoiding him, and focused on the machine as it activated. Oh! The students gasped with interest as two pillars slid out from a hidden compartment within the device. They stood perpendicular to one another and were made from a glass-like material. Several runes were visible on their surfaces, and once activated, they began to glow brightly. A laser-like beam emerged between them and focused on the student standing at the center. Then the pillars began moving in a circular pattern around him, scanning his entire body in the process. The beam passed over him from head to toe several times before the runes engraved within gradually dimmed. The entire procedure took only about a minute and was monitored by another rune mage through a nearby display. How magnificent! Everything seems to be working according to the runic systems. Arian was quite pleased as he floated toward the panels. Roland had helped him design the graphical interfaces for the runic operating system, awakening a strange fascination in the feline rune mage. From what Roland knew, Arian had spent half of his days experimenting with the data on modern computer operating systems and user interfaces. He was the one who had designed the graphics displayed on the current monitor. A recreation of the student's body appeared on one side of the screen, while all of their statistics were listed on the other. Their level, attributes, learned skills, and even titles could be recorded. It was a complete scan of the individual, though most of the information remained hidden from view. What the students saw was a simplified version containing only a few key data points. Even so, it was enough to determine which events suited them best. Sebastian was not present, but the academy possessed multiple magic towers and magic spirits. The runic department had access to all of that computing power, and Arian had spent considerable time designing a system capable of analyzing every statistic and skill a student possessed. Whether they were best suited for a treasure hunt or a flag battle, the system would perform its calculations and provide the three most suitable options. Let's see. Arian floated toward one of his assistants. The man was studying a screen beside a stack of blank scrolls. Once the skin was complete, the bolt stopped spinning and the student was allowed to step down, but the process was not yet finished. A floating pen hovered nearby, enchanted through runic magic. After the skin concluded, it began moving across a sheet of paper, writing down the student's name along with the three competitions available to them. While the academy could have assigned events directly, they preferred to give the young mages a choice that they could mark down themselves. Nevertheless, not every competition had room for everyone. Most of the youths would naturally choose the events that offered the greatest number of merits rather than those best suited to their abilities. Because of this, the system maintained priority rankings and compatibility percentages for every role while also taking academic performance into account. Everything was calculated through the system Arian and Roland had devised. I wonder what she'll get. Based on her current skills and spells, it's probably going to be that one. Roland had helped design the system, so he could predict the likely outcomes almost instinctively. Lucienne's class, talents, and recently acquired skills were already known to him. Even though her level lagged somewhat behind the others due to her long absence, her rare class compensated for many shortcomings and made her a highly desirable candidate for one particular competition in her age bracket. His gaze shifted briefly toward the back of the hall where she stood. She was trying very hard not to attract attention, though she was not particularly good at it. Every so often, she glanced in his direction as if she were afraid to face him. He was not entirely sure why, but perhaps she worried that he would disapprove of her decision to leave the institute. Although the inter-school competition was a prestigious event where young mages could prove themselves, injuries were not uncommon. Some participants took it very seriously and had no qualms about cheating or harming their rivals. His sister would be entering such an environment and could potentially find herself in danger while he was occupied with his own competition. Should I stop it? Roland held enough influence to make it happen if he wished. If he decided to deny her entry, he probably could. Arian would listen to his advice if he deemed Lucienne unsuitable. Yet Roland could not help wondering whether she would resent him for it. The thought made the decision far more difficult than it should have been, but a choice needed to be made. Now then, Lucienne Arden, step forward. Arian had finally called out Roland's sister's name. The moment he did, Roland looked in her direction. The other students were not paying much attention, and none of her friends were present either, as she was the only one who had made it this far. Her friends, Adesuna and Marline, were not bad students, but they were more ordinary in terms of talent. Only the top 2 or 3 students from each class could ever hope to reach this competition. With multiple classes and hundreds of students in each year, earning a place here was no easy feat. That girl Margaret could have probably gotten in, but she has not returned since Robert's trial, neither is that prince here. The girl he suspected was a member of royalty or high nobility was absent. So was the prince who had caused the entire incident with Viola Castellane. High nobles seemed to have a tendency to create chaos and then disappear before facing the consequences. With enough wealth and influence to hire the finest private tutors, attending a magic academy like this was often little more than a formality. Lucienne had grown considerably, and it was becoming clear that she was maturing into a proper noble lady. Roland could easily imagine a line of suitors eager to seek her hand in marriage. The only thing delaying such advances was her place at the institute, where she could continue living and studying. He was not entirely sure what plans his sister had for the future. She never seemed particularly eager to marry, but with Robert's disappearance, she had become the only unmarried member of the family. His older brothers and sisters had already wed. Some had children, while others were too occupied with their duties to start families of their own. That left Lucienne as the family's final bargaining piece if they ever wished to strengthen political ties through marriage. I hope she can choose her own path, and if she ever wants my help. Roland had already done it once. If Lucienne ever decided she wanted to leave the family behind, helping her disappear was not out of the question. Still, he could not imagine her making such a choice because of her mother. Robert's disappearance had already taken a heavy toll on her, and for the foreseeable future, they needed to keep his continued presence within the kingdom a secret. Pushing those intrusive thoughts aside, Roland watched quietly as Lucienne made her way through the rows of students. Unlike many of the others who had stepped forward with confidence, she appeared noticeably nervous. Her shoulders were straight and her uniform immaculate, but there was a subtle hesitation in her movements that only someone familiar with her would notice. The blonde girl reached the platform and stopped before the scanner. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Lucienne offered an awkward smile, as if she was unsure how to react. Roland resisted the urge to sigh and instead turned his attention toward Ariane, who activated the scanner. Just as it had many times before, the device began to move. Bright lights swept across her body as it scanned her status while concealing details such as her class from curious onlookers. Normally, such secrecy would not be permitted, but the trust placed in the academy was immense. Besides, a student's class could often be identified even without the machine's assistance. Roland already knew what the results would be before they appeared on paper. Lucienne's class was that of a clairvoyant, an uncommon class that was not considered particularly powerful. At first glance, some people might wonder what use such a class could have in a competition, but in reality, there were many. Tracking spells existed and could be used by almost everyone. The same could be said of classes with tracking abilities, but all of them paled in comparison to the clairvoyant line of classes that could eventually become oracles. These mages could pierce even the strongest barriers and locate almost anything within their range. In competitions where finding hidden objects often determined the outcome, Lucienne's class was almost unfair. A class like hers could uncover not only hidden traps inside a dungeon but also paths leading to treasure that most people would overlook. However, due to its lack of offensive and defensive capabilities, it lagged behind other mage classes. She could not cast devastating elemental spells, disable opponents with debilitating effects, or summon powerful creatures to her aid. It was primarily a support class and, when it came to spelunking, often had more drawbacks than advantages. An experienced tracker could usually perform well enough while still maintaining far greater combat effectiveness. Yet with enough preparation and a capable defensive force, an oracle could turn the tide of battle. They could predict ambushes or uncover hidden routes long before the enemy realized they had been exposed. Entire expeditions had survived solely because someone with such abilities had been present. A valuable military asset. I wonder what Wentworth intends to do with Lucienne. As he reviewed his sister's results, his thoughts turned to his father, a military man who held the rank of marshal. Lucienne could potentially be used to predict attacks from rival empires, something that became increasingly possible as an oracle's powers grew. An oracle could even listen in on private conversations and relay that information to their allies. It was much like a camera, except one that could not be detected until it was too late. Please, take this student, and be sure to return this paper after marking down your event. Now then, let us continue with the next. Ariane set aside the paper listing Lucienne's events. At the top was the treasure hunt competition, one of the Academy's most sought-after events. The choice was obvious, as her ability to detect hidden objects made her exceptionally suited for it. Groups of mages would be sent into a vast area filled with concealed treasures. Some would be hidden in chests, others tucked away in hollow tree trunks or buried beneath the ground. The team that recovered the most valuables would be declared the winner. A clairvoyant was perfectly suited for such a competition. Their ability to search was extraordinary, making them akin to a living radar capable of detecting almost anything within range. The other two events assigned to her were different but not surprising. One was the reconnaissance exercise, a competition focused on gathering information while avoiding detection. Teams would be placed within a controlled environment and tasked with locating designated targets, observing enemy movements, and reporting their findings before time ran out. For most students, it was considered one of the less glamorous events. Its purpose was to test stealth magic and intelligence-gathering capabilities. With Lucienne on the team, they would have someone capable of detecting enemy movement with ease. She would likely be able to spot ambushes and identify dummy targets before anyone else. A clairvoyance ability to gather information was invaluable. There were limits to what she could perceive, but even at Tier 1, she could listen in on conversations as long as someone concealed her with stealth magic and brought her close enough to the target. As she advanced through her class progression, those abilities would only become more powerful. The last one was somewhat similar to the first, as it involved a maze and item retrieval. A group would need to overcome various obstacles, solve magical puzzles, and recover an artifact hidden somewhere within the labyrinth. Their time would be measured, and the team with the fastest record would emerge victorious. Which one will she go with? Roland saw Lucienne peeking over the paper before quickly covering her face like a child caught doing something she should not. He was not sure what she was thinking, but perhaps she was worried he would stop her from participating in any dangerous events. Of the three, the treasure hunt was probably the most dangerous, followed by the maze. The reconnaissance exercise was likely the safest, at least on paper. In reality, any competition could become dangerous if rival academies decided to push the limits of what was considered acceptable. There were other options as well. One event involved searching for ingredients in an enchanted garden, while another required participants to follow a chain of clues and solve puzzles. Neither was particularly popular, and both were generally considered rather dull. The selection system was designed to present participants with the more sought-after competitions first. Roland could have influenced the outcome, but he chose not to. Lucienne lowered the sheet and read through the listed options once more. Her eyes clearly lingered on the treasure hunt at the top, the most popular one of them all. Of course she would go for that one. Roland was not surprised. To be honest, it played directly to her strengths. With the right team of students, he could see her succeeding. Although the event centered on finding treasure, it did not mean there would be no magical battles involved. There was also the matter of teams being able to steal merit points from one another during the competition. This was one of the reasons the event was broadcast on specialized magical crystals. Everyone could watch and cheer for their chosen team, while the smaller competitions received only limited attention from the audience. The treasure hunt was an academy favorite because it combined exploration, strategy, magical combat, and more than a little drama. With Lucienne serving as the team's primary tracker, they would need a capable vanguard. Someone had to hold back opponents while she focused on locating targets. A durable earth mage or a combatant capable of using enhancement magic would be ideal, and there was someone fitting that description among the students gathered here. The second key member would need to provide mobility. His sister's physical capabilities were rather limited, so someone who could summon beasts to serve as mounts would be valuable. Beyond that, they would need several mages capable of supporting the group from the back lines with defensive and offensive spells, along with a dedicated support specialist. There is a strong team here. With these students, it's doable, and it's one of the events that awards a large number of points. Although he had not initially supported the idea, he was still here to secure a strong placement for their magic school. The competition would be fierce, but if he managed to accomplish what he was planning, he could not see himself losing. For most people, creating custom runic accessories to enhance magical abilities would be a difficult task. With the help of this machine, however, crafting something perfectly suited to each student would be child's play. It would simply require a considerable amount of time. Professor Arian, could you continue here? I need to attend to something else. Oh? Sure, Deputy Professor. Go ahead. Let's meet back at the runic department. Roland nodded. For the time being, he would not confront his sister about the choice, as the students had 3 days to turn in their papers. What he needed to do now was contact the headmistress and ask about the rules regarding the competition. People stepped aside when they saw him, though the halls were still crowded. By the time he arrived at the large park area, he noticed far fewer students relaxing, as most were probably busy packing. Instead of heading to the headmistress's tower, he made his way to his own office beneath it. From there, he could contact Yavana without any trouble. Once seated at his desk, he activated the spell connecting him to her. The wood began to shift, and a small flower emerged from the surface. A voice soon drifted from within it. Deputy Professor Wayland? It's rare for you to contact me directly. Is something wrong? Are the students not to your liking? To his surprise, she responded immediately. Of course, she could have been feigning surprise. The runic monitoring system was at her fingertips, and she possessed her own methods of keeping tabs on people like him. Within the garden, there was probably no one who could entirely escape her notice. It's not about the students. I just wanted to confirm some of the rules for the Quinquennial Arcane Institute convocation. The rules? If you want the rules, you can consult the guide. Nothing has changed. I know. I just wanted to confirm something. There doesn't seem to be a limit on the support items students can use. Magic potions, high-level enchantments, and even single-use scrolls all appear to be permitted, provided they fit inside the school-issued spatial bags. Is that correct? I believe so. Is there a problem? No, but would something that functions like a mana recovery potion, except in the form of a bracelet or another accessory, be allowed? Oh? Does such a device exist? Yes. It could be provided to students and, in theory, would offset their mana consumption far more effectively than a standard mana potion, all without the side effects associated with mana toxicity. That was the main reason he had contacted her. After reviewing the convocation's rules, he had found them surprisingly lax. Nearly all forms of enchanted equipment were allowed, provided they did not exceed a student's tier. A Tier 1 student, for instance, was restricted to Tier 1 runic equipment. Because of the extensive research he had conducted on his disciple Millie and her bracelet, he was confident he could reproduce similar equipment for others. Mages relied heavily on mana, and their options for sustaining it were generally limited to mana potions or items that increased their mana reserves or regeneration. Roland, however, could provide something far superior. Bracelets powered by runic batteries. Such devices could absorb a significant portion of a spell's mana cost, granting students a tremendous advantage in competitions that relied primarily on magic. It was an advantage that other schools either had not pursued or, more likely, could not produce on a large scale. Perhaps they could secure similar items for a handful of elite students, but the average young mage would never receive such treatment. Roland, on the other hand, had already begun scanning every student, cataloging their strengths, weaknesses, and mana patterns. With that information, he could craft versions of Millie's bracelet tailored to each of them. That's an intriguing idea. Could you tell me more? He could tell that the Archmagus was interested in what he was planning, so he quickly explained everything to her. While the rules did not forbid it, he wanted to make sure he was not dragging the institute into some kind of scandal. He knew the other schools might protest if they saw this type of technology. What do you think, headmistress? Would the other mages be offended? Offended? Ha! Let them be. I give you my full permission, Deputy Professor. Roland was not sure what Yavana's expression looked like on the other side of the call, but her tone sounded rather cheerful. Then I shall do it. After confirming that he had permission to proceed and that there were very few restrictions, he felt relieved. The golem was one thing, but winning only that single event would not give him what he wanted. You've given me something to look forward to, Deputy Professor. I'll try not to disappoint you, Headmistress. I know you won't. He was not sure where her confidence came from, but he chose not to respond. Soon, the flower faded back into the wooden desk. He was preparing to leave when he noticed someone entering the park. It was his sister. Does she want to talk to me? Lucienne looked both nervous and excited as she approached the tree that concealed the path to his office. Few people visited this place, and even fewer knew it existed. Roland remained where he stood for a moment, watching his sister move through the monitoring system outside. Come in. His voice echoed beyond the office, and the path opened before her. His sister nearly stumbled and fell to the ground, but she managed to recover and soon disappeared inside. Deputy Professor. You can just call me by my name here. Brother Roland, I wasn't trying to hide anything. It's just. It seemed she was worried about how he would react to her gaining a position in the convocation. You don't need to worry. I'm not angry, and it's not as if we can speak freely under these circumstances. He stopped her before she could work herself into a nervous mess. Instead, he asked a simple question. So, which competition interests you the most? Which one? She seemed surprised that he was not trying to convince her not to participate. It was understandable. Both Robert and their mother were quite protective of Lucienne, which had left her with little freedom and made her hesitant to share anything that might worry others. It was one of the main reasons the Viola incident had occurred, but he would not let something like that hold his sister back. He was prepared to help her achieve victory and help her gain more trust in her own skills. Lucienne lowered her gaze to the paper in her hands. For a few seconds, she seemed to debate whether to answer honestly or give the safe response everyone expected from her. Finally, she took a breath and responded. The treasure hunt. Roland nodded. I thought so. He replied nonchalantly without raising his voice. His sister waited for a moment, as if expecting him to object, but he said nothing. You are not against it? Her eyes widened slightly. No. The answer came so quickly that it caught her off guard. I expected you to say it was too dangerous. I'm not your mother. Besides, the event will be well protected by mages, and you cannot really be harmed during the competition. Roland had done his research. The Quinquennial Arcane Institute convocation would take place in a special location created by ancient archmages, with safety being one of their primary concerns. While injuries could occur, fatalities were practically unheard of. The entire competition grounds would be monitored by powerful overseers capable of intervening the moment something went wrong. You can't. Lucienne. Maybe you should research the things you sign up for before making a decision. His sister glanced away after being caught uninformed. He could not blame her too much. She was still young and was probably just excited to have been accepted into something so prestigious and rare. The competitions take place within a massive protective array. If someone's life is at risk, they are teleported outside and healed. Oh! Something so grand exists there. Indeed. It is one of the great wonders of the kingdom. Some say it is even Tier 5 magic. Wow! Lucienne's eyes sparkled at the mention of Tier 5 magic, which was considered the pinnacle in this world, or at least that was what most people believed. Roland could not be certain whether it was truly the limit, but all available evidence seemed to point in that direction. However, he was not sure whether a hard limit actually existed or whether there simply were not enough Tier 5 creatures for anyone to progress beyond that stage. Eventually, Tier 4 monsters would no longer provide enough experience to level up. Even a super dungeon like the one on Dragna's Island contained only a single creature of that power, and it had never been defeated. Those who reached the final tier of power rarely continued seeking battle. Most assumed positions of authority, ruling kingdoms, dedicating themselves to research, or simply enjoying the rewards of reaching the summit. Risking one's life became far less appealing when an entire nation depended on one's continued existence. Yet wars still erupted between nations from time to time, and when Tier 5 leaders clashed, entire cities and battlefields could be devastated. These people were the atomic bombs of this world, and perhaps one day he would become one of them as well. It sounds amazing. Lucienne clutched the paper a little tighter. It is. Though the protective array is only one reason the convocation has endured for so long. The participating academies invest far too many resources in their students to allow needless deaths. Roland leaned back in his chair as he continued. The students represent the future of their nations. Losing talented young mages would be a waste. His sister nodded slowly before looking down at the list again. Then. I think I want to participate, but I'm not sure what Mother will say. Maybe, if we don't tell her. His sister was clearly afraid that her mother would not allow her to participate. Since Robert's disappearance, she had become especially protective of her youngest child. No, that won't do. Ask your mother, and if she refuses, then that will be the end of it. Roland wasn't about to let his sister lie her way through it. He had become quite skilled at lying over the course of his life, and he did not want Lucienne to pick up his habit of twisting the truth. This was still only a competition between schools. Even if she could help them win the treasure hunt event, she was not irreplaceable. Now that I think about it. Lucienne was a young mage with a bright future, but that did not mean there were no other options. He was not sure whether he was overthinking things, but after this conversation, he had a few matters he wanted to investigate. But Brother Roland, what if she says no? Then you can ask Father instead. Father, Lucienne's shoulders slumped at his reply. No one in the family could speak to Wentworth with any real ease. Reaching him was difficult as well. He spent most of his time near the borders, overseeing military operations and protecting the kingdom from monsters and foreign threats. I know, but keeping it secret from them would only make things worse once they found out. Ask for permission first, and after that we can discuss the competition. I suppose so. Roland would have preferred that Francine not get involved, but she had a right to know and a right to attend. He was old enough to understand that any parent would be disappointed if their child participated in such a major event and they were unable to witness it. Maybe Robert could say hello to her as well, but it could become dangerous. There was also the matter of his elder brother, who would be participating not only as the Golem's pilot but also as someone who wanted to see his sister. Under normal circumstances, Lucienne would have remained one of many students watching from the sidelines while the other young mages competed. Now she would be an active participant, which made it easier for his brother to meet her. It also gave Roland a legitimate reason to interact with her and the others. I might be able to bring Robert over sooner than I expected. Lucienne let out a small sigh. So I really have to ask her. Indeed. Now then, how about you tell me how you've been doing these past few months? Roland did not have much time to spare, and he had been free from lecturing duties for a while, so he had not been paying much attention to his sister lately. Arian had given him a few reports, and he also had access to the monitoring system, but nothing unusual had happened. Even so, he had not realized that she had performed well enough to be promoted to event participant. Oh! It's been quite fun. It was so boring back home. All my friends were left at the institute, and the magic instructor mother hired was rather boring. The topic shifted, and Lucienne quickly began talking at length. Her cheerful personality had returned, and it seemed that the bullying incident involving Viola was no longer bothering her very much. Is that so? As Lucienne spoke, her words came faster, as though a dam had finally broken. She talked about her classes, how she had struggled at first with her new spells, and how confusing it had been to grasp clairvoyance. It was really hard. It's like having a completely new sense. It feels as though I have a third eye that can see through walls. Roland nodded. He understood how difficult such abilities could be to master. Even his multiple mind trait had been awkward at first and had taken considerable time to control. As a clairvoyant, Lucienne could see at a distance and sense far more of her surroundings. Even though her range was still short at Tier 1, she needed time to adapt to it. Once she became an oracle, her vision might one day reach the far side of the kingdom. It'll take time for you to grasp it. It would be best if you continue training while under distress, as you might not be able to concentrate during the... As he spoke, he noticed his sister starting to chuckle and immediately realized why. Ah, sorry. It's okay, Brother Roland. I'll be sure to practice hard. He had just managed to change the subject, but he could not help thinking about improving his sister's abilities and helping her become stronger. He had almost brought up the competition again. The two siblings smiled at each other and continued talking for a while longer, but eventually it was time to part ways. If we talk any longer, the other teacher might grow suspicious. Go back to your friends and think it over again. You still have 3 days to turn in the paper. I will. Lucienne nodded several times before jumping forward to hug him. It was a nice change from their first meeting, when she had almost broken her hand trying to punch him. This time, he returned the embrace without the usual awkward pause between them. Stay clear of trouble. I always stay clear of trouble. She replied with a grin before hopping back. A bright smile remained on her face as she spun on her heel and headed for the exit. The entrance door parted to let her through, and he watched her emerge on the other side. Just as before, the Lady Knight was waiting for her outside. Ivita had been concealing her presence and following her lady from the beginning. Only within this office could he speak to Lucienne freely. Everywhere else, the knight was always watching. She is quite competent, but... Although Ivita was a capable knight, professors with similarly secluded offices could probably separate his sister from her guard. It was a blind spot that could be exploited. He still could not fully trust everyone at the institute, but there was no one he genuinely suspected of seeking revenge on Viola's behalf. Now then, I should finish up here as well. With his sister returning to the dorms and the scanning session coming to an end, there were only a few things left to do before he could head home to more work. Thus, he made his way back to the runic department, where a number of people were moving about. This place has certainly become a lot livelier. The department had been almost deserted when he first arrived at the institute. Only Arian had been present, along with a few dwarves assembling equipment. The lecture halls had been nearly empty, with students attending mainly because the class required little effort and awarded a few merit points. So even though most of the department is still in the hall, there are still some people left here. Arian still hasn't come back, though. He arrived a little sooner than expected and stepped through the door. Inside, there was only one other person. It was someone he had seen before but never really spoken to. Deputy P. Professor W. Wayland, what brings you here? It was an assistant teacher, not even an assistant professor. He looked quite young and stuttered through nearly every word. He was of average height, with a bowl cut and large glasses that dominated his face. In his previous world, people like him would have been considered nerdy. Here, however, he looked like a fairly typical mage with a few quirks. I'm just waiting for Professor Arian to come back. Don't mind me and get back to whatever you were doing. He decided to look through the student list using his helmet. It was connected to the database of the entire runic department, and he was here to speak with Arian about the students. While he could view their statistics through the scanner, it was best to ask for advice when it came to the youths themselves. He knew nothing about their personalities or circumstances. If he was going to form a party suited for Lucien's class, the more information he had, the better. There was, however, one small problem. Can I help you with something? And no, sir. The assistant teacher continued to stare at him with strange intensity, making the whole situation rather awkward. The man swallowed again as if he wanted to say something but lacked the courage to do so. Roland used the opportunity to browse the department personnel database, which was surprisingly extensive. Arian had streamlined everything and even included photographs of every staff member, making identification easy. You're Stephen, right? Specialty, data gathering and record management. Oh, Sir Deputy knows about me. The young man was clearly surprised and unable to hide his excitement. Data gathering? Hey! Stephen, can you do something for me? Me? Do something for you? It would be an honor. Something had been bothering Roland for a while, and it required a bit of investigation. He neither had the time to search through the institute himself nor knew where to begin. Fortunately, this person could do it for him. Stephen was a former student who had become a teacher, which meant he probably knew the institute inside and out. Yes. I want you to look into something for me. Anything for you, Deputy P. Professor. Stephen stood at attention like a soldier receiving orders. He looked awkward and somewhat unreliable, but according to the description Roland was reading, the man excelled at gathering information and organizing it into spreadsheets. He was probably the perfect person for the task. If the results proved disappointing, Roland could always investigate everything himself later. Good. Then I want you to look into a few students who will be participating in the upcoming convocation. Leave it to me. Roland nodded before glancing at a magical quill resting nearby. By interfacing with its operating system, he could make it write words automatically, much like a modern printer. The quill sprang to life and began listing names, his sisters included. Although she was his primary concern, he did not want to draw attention to her or appear biased. Her name was mixed among many others, making it indistinguishable from the rest of the selected participants. Stephen leaned forward slightly, his eyes darting over the floating script as the quill moved on its own. Each name appeared in neat, precise strokes until a roster of 20 students hung in the air before them. Roland considered these youths likely candidates for the core of their future force, so any additional information about their lives, interests, or circumstances would help him choose the right people for the job. I want background information. Not just academic records. Anything you can find. Include their test results from the past year and a list of the classes they've attended. Why yes, sir. Stephen replied immediately. I can gather all of that. It might take some time, but I can do it. It would be great if you could gather it within 3 days, but don't push yourself too hard. Before he could finish the sentence, the young man stepped forward and shouted. 3 days is fine. Leave it to me. Are you sure? Why yes, leave it to me. He still stuttered as before, but not nearly as much. It was as if he wanted to prove himself for some reason. Roland had not intended to pressure him. He knew it would be a troublesome task to run between departments gathering all the necessary data. However, if Stephen felt confident about it, he was not going to stop him. Fine then. I'll check in with you again in 3 days. The man smiled, bowed, and then ran out of the department in an instant. He really is dedicated. Roland finished the thought to himself as he watched Stephen disappear down the corridor at a pace that nearly caused him to trip over his own feet. Either way, this worked out well for him. If the man did a good job, he would have all the important background information he needed. He then waited for Arian to return and discuss the students with him. The data had been processed, and all the classes were laid out before them. As expected, there were no surprises. No hidden cultists or evil warlocks lurked among the students. The students were scrutinized far too closely by their teachers for cultists to use them as spies. The people he needed to watch out for were the teachers and mages with ulterior motives. After finishing up, he returned through the gate to continue working on the golem and to visit the dungeon for training with Agni. 3 days later, he returned to the institute to finalize the battle plan. Only after the students had chosen their disciplines could he properly devise a strategy. Creating the right devices was only half the battle. The synergy between classes and individuals was likely even more important, and it was something he was not looking forward to dealing with. "Yes sir, I've been waiting for you." "Hey." Roland returned to the institute 3 days later, after all the students had turned in their papers. To his surprise, the moment he stepped out of the teleportation gate area, he was intercepted by the young man he had met recently, Stephen. "He looks like he hasn't slept since I gave him that assignment." Stephen's hair was somehow even messy than before. The bowl cut had completely lost its battle against gravity, and the large glasses resting on his nose sat slightly crooked. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, making it look as though someone had punched him. Despite his appearance, he held a neatly organized stack of papers against his chest. "Stephen. Deputy Professor Wayland. I have been waiting for you." The young man nearly saluted while trying not to drop the mountain of documents he was carrying. It was clear that he had taken the assignment very seriously and had probably not slept much since Roland gave him the task. Roland did not understand where this level of dedication came from, but it was obvious that Stephen was desperate to get on his good side. "I hope you haven't been standing here waiting for me." "Oh no, Deputy sir, and not the whole time." The answer came quickly, and Stephen even seemed proud of his dedication. It only made Roland stare at him harder. "How long exactly?" Stephen hesitated as he noticed the change in tone. "Oh, just 3 hours." "I see." Roland was not entirely sure how to respond to someone like this, but if Stephen did good work, there was no reason not to help him when the opportunity arose. "Walk with me. I'm heading to the runic department now. I assume this is what I asked you for." "Why yes." Stephen eagerly presented the stack of papers to Roland. The man was only a Tier 2 mage, with his first advancement being that of a wind mage rather than a runic mage. There were several people like him at the department, including Lucille, who later switched to rune mage. Is he planning to switch professions, too? While it was not the most efficient path toward obtaining a Tier 3 rune mage class, it was still possible if a person followed the proper training and acquired the necessary skills. With Arian serving as department head, he could likely provide everyone with the guidance needed to ensure their earlier classes did not go to waste. There were also advantages to being an elemental mage before becoming a rune mage. When working with runes aligned with their element, they gained increased power and reduced mana consumption. If Stephen eventually became a Tier 3 Master Rune Mage, using the Zephyr armor would be a real possibility. These look thoroughly researched. You did all of this in just 3 days. As they walked, Roland began looking through the documents. Some pages had been stapled together and contained detailed reports on the students he had selected. After flipping through only a few of them, he realized that Stephen had not simply completed the assignment. He had gone far beyond what was required. Each student's file had been divided into clearly organized sections: academic performance, combat evaluations, magical aptitude tests, disciplinary records, attendance history, and more. There were even notes on family backgrounds, social standing within the kingdom, and comments gathered from teachers and instructors. Roland would still need to conduct some research of his own, but after comparing a few entries about his sister, he quickly confirmed that the information was reliable. He even included the disappearance of Robert in this. There was far more information about Lucienne here than he had expected. His own name was even listed in the family records, along with a note stating that he had been officially declared dead after all these years. Considering how well everything had been put together, he was now convinced that the rest of the background checks were just as thorough and extensive. "You've gone far beyond what I asked for." Stephen froze for a moment before his face turned red. It seemed he had gotten the wrong idea. I just thought more information would be better. If it's not to your liking, then I'll remake it." "You misunderstand. It's great work, but you didn't have to be so thorough. Perhaps you should get some sleep first as well." Roland turned a page while speaking, trying to calm the young man down. People continued glancing their way as they passed by. From the looks of it, he appeared to be bullying an assistant teacher. Stephen kept lowering his head and apologizing at the slightest prompting, and it was beginning to wear on him. I am fine. I drank a few stamina potions already. I'll be fine for another 2 days. While the stamina potions in this world were not as bad as the energy drinks from his previous one, they were still unhealthy when consumed in excess. Yet as he examined Stephen's status, he noticed a familiar skill among the listed abilities, sleep resistance. You've done this before, haven't you? Well, I can't stop you, but it would be better if you got some actual rest. Stephen opened his mouth to protest immediately. But the reports are not fully indexed yet. Fully indexed. Roland glanced down at the stack again. There had to be nearly 40 pages here, with 2 or more dedicated to each student. It already looked extensive, yet Stephen was implying there was much more. I created separate summaries, cross-references, aptitude rankings, class compatibility charts, projected growth estimates, and a list of possible team combinations based on historical convocation data. For a moment, Roland simply stared at the man who had somehow stopped stuttering and was now speaking at remarkable speed. Apparently, he had already prepared, or was in the process of preparing, a collection of charts and evaluations far beyond anything Roland had expected. Where is Arian finding people like this? The man standing before him was clearly a hidden gem when it came to gathering and organizing information. If he could accomplish this much in only 3 days, what could he achieve with better customized runic equipment and more time? Stephen, what do you hope to gain from all of this? Sir. What do you want in return for this work? He knew that this level of dedication did not come cheaply. If Stephen was capable of doing so much, there was plenty of information Roland could make use of. The man could gather intelligence on rival schools, compile reports on their strengths, and perhaps even conduct background checks on their students. The academy libraries contained a vast number of records covering previous competitions, but sorting through them all would be a monumental task. Roland had originally planned to have Sebastian review and summarize the material for him. However, if he could rely on someone with genuine talent for this kind of work, the results would likely be far superior to anything his incomplete AI system could produce. Stephen's eyes widened as though the question had never occurred to him. What do I want? Yes. Roland continued walking without slowing down. Students and instructors passed them in the corridor, some greeting him respectfully before hurrying on their way. Stephen remained silent for several seconds, clutching the reports tighter against his chest. I don't really need anything. I find that difficult to believe. Then maybe. He lowered his voice. Maybe some special TT in the D department. Roland stopped and looked at the bowl-cut man beside him. He was a very strange individual. He had expected him to ask for special skill books, access to the higher levels of the library reserved for Tier 3 professors, or perhaps even support for some personal research project. Instead, he was asking for tea. Why yes, the O1 in the D department isn't very good. Sure. I'll ask Arian to get you some tea. He doesn't seem to be a cultist or an evil mage. Is he just, like this? Mages were often considered eccentric, but Stephen seemed to belong to an entirely different category. Roland had met obsessive researchers before, like Arian, and others who experimented to their own detriment, like Rastix. There were also more than a few battle maniacs. Yet this man had spent 3 days compiling what looked like a military intelligence dossier in exchange for slightly better tea. Ah, my friend, I see you've been getting acquainted with our new assistant. He is quite the dedicated worker. At last, Roland arrived at the runic department where Arian and a group of assistant professors and teachers greeted him. I did. He is quite talented. Roland was not entirely sure how to describe the man, but Stephen seemed pleased to be praised in front of the department head. Splendid. Now then, everyone is in the process of data input, but everything should be finished soon. Arian pointed with his paw toward the assistants. Many were writing on parchment at remarkable speed, while others fed papers into a peculiar device. 3 golemic eyes hovered above it, watching over a flat surface where each document was placed. Once positioned, a brief flash of light escaped from the orbs before the paper was replaced. The information was then transferred as a snapshot onto one of the assembled monitors and processed through the interface Arian had programmed. This is all thanks to you, my friend. It's all so efficient. To people who had never worked with scanners or the internet, the system was revolutionary. Roland, however, knew there was still plenty of room for improvement. Much of the process could be automated, and golems could eventually handle a large portion of the workload currently assigned to the assistant professors. Roland surveyed the room once more while the assistants continued feeding documents into the scanning apparatus. Now that most of the work was being handled for him, he could focus on his own task, producing the equipment for the participants. He had already brought a prototype with him. As we discussed before, I brought the items over. I also made several variants, so have the dwarven craftsmen assemble a few replacements. The moment Roland mentioned the runic device prototypes, most of the assistants in the chamber turned toward him with interest. Even Stephen, who looked ready to collapse from exhaustion, forced himself to remain upright. The first one is a standard bracelet. Once the correct mana pattern is entered into the core system, it will reduce the mana cost of various spells, lowering the casting cost of any spell by 50%. A whole 50%. Stephen raised his voice, then instantly covered his mouth when the others looked at him with irritation. It was as if the other assistants were angry at him for interrupting Roland's presentation. Yes, once the students get used to these prototypes, we'll be able to lower it even further. I think 70% should be possible for Tier 1 spells and over 50% for Tier 2 spells. Of course, there will also be an added mana regeneration effect to complement everything. And if you could take a look at this. He gestured for everyone to watch before placing several more models on the table. One was a choker designed to be worn around the neck, another was an ankle bracelet, and there were also several rings. I'm not sure which designs the students will prefer, so it would be good if you let them choose the ones they like most. Roland knew that children that age could be picky. Some would probably prefer a bracelet, others something worn around the neck, and some might even favor a magical belt. He could make them in all shapes and sizes. Even full metal armor was possible, but he knew that mages generally preferred lighter equipment. The room fell silent. It was clear that the assistants were too hesitant to ask the obvious question of how any of this actually worked. Creating magical items that reduced casting requirements was possible, but not to such an extreme degree. You have some questions? Arian asked as he turned toward the assistant professors. I'm sure you're wondering how we can achieve such results while limiting ourselves to Tier 1 and Tier 2 runes. Roland cut in when he saw the others nodding, Stephen included. It's actually quite simple. We're going to use an external power source. Here. The time had finally come to reveal one of his trump cards, the runic battery, the most crucial element of the entire design. Even though he was limited to inferior metals and simpler runes, the contenders would still have access to spatial bags. Normally, they would use them to carry large quantities of mana potions, but instead, they could carry something far more useful, batteries. This is a runic battery. It will provide mana for the students and holds as much energy as 10 mana potions of the same grade. He placed the small, cylindrical battery on the table, and everyone examined it curiously. No one spoke, but it was obvious they wanted a closer look. The logic behind the technology was quite simple, which was one of the reasons he was so eager to implement it. Replacing a battery was much easier than drinking a potion. It even worked when someone simply held it in their hand, as it could connect over a short distance through ethereal runic pathways. Such a thing exists? Is there mana fluid inside? Wouldn't that potentially be dangerous for the students? One of the assistants asked, and the others waited eagerly for Roland's answer. There's nothing inside except more runes. He tapped the battery against the metal bracelet on the table. The battery contained runes not only on its exterior but also throughout its interior, maximizing the amount of mana it could store. There were no moving parts, crystals, or fluids inside. Everything was embedded directly into the alloy and produced in his workshop. It was a process that the dwarven craftsman could easily replicate without his assistance, allowing him to focus on other projects. After all, there were many ways to aid the young mages beyond simply solving their mana problems. Armor and weaponry were another issue. Each student could either wear the standard institute robes or bring their own. The use of personalized magical staves or wands was also permitted. However, that would come later in the outfitting process, as he first needed to gather training data on the students and review the information Stephen had provided. How marvelous, I can't wait. Arian floated in the air and used a mage hand spell to move the battery closer to his feline face. Professor Arian, why don't you take it from here? I've already provided you with the schematics. With pleasure, Deputy Professor. Roland left the gathered assistants to Arian's enthusiastic explanation and stepped away. He had come here today for two main reasons. The first was to introduce the department to his mana-boosting accessories. The second was to obtain data on the students, which Stephen had already supplied. There was also a third matter, one that had been bothering him and involved his sister. They looked quite enthralled. With everyone focused on Arian, Roland was finally able to slip away to his office within the institute. While it was not quite a workshop, it still provided access to several points within the monitoring system. He had also brought a few items from his place to make the space feel more personal. Once inside, he retrieved a monitor along with several blocky devices covered in runes. If he was going to assist here, he needed a place where he could process data without the runic department becoming aware of everything he was doing. While he trusted Arian with certain matters, there were still secrets he intended to keep, including his true name. The headmistress already knew the truth, so setting up beneath her tree tower had never seemed like a problem to him. Now then, I need to get through this. After turning on the monitor and confirming he had a clear view of the activities outside, he retrieved the documents concerning his sister. He quickly turned to the section that interested him most, her grades. Close to perfect scores across the board, and they keep improving. Am I being too paranoid? It was entirely possible that Lucienne's home tutor had done an excellent job and that her results were simply the product of hard work. Even so, he could not shake the feeling that an unseen hand was guiding her forward. He had no real evidence beyond a lingering suspicion. There's a list of the classes and professors who assigned her grades. I should investigate them first, then determine who they report to. It would not be an easy task. At first glance, the teachers and professors appeared unconnected. The classes were spread across various departments and showed no obvious links to one another. Yet if he failed to investigate, he knew the matter would continue to trouble him. Perhaps it was nothing. Still, it was always wise to have a plan in place in case events failed to unfold as expected. The door slid open by itself the moment Lucienne approached, moving aside before she could even reach for it. Behind her, the hall was unusually quiet. The noise that had filled the academy over the past few weeks had finally faded now that the examinations were over and many of the students had returned home. She, however, had been selected to participate in the upcoming convocation. For a moment, she remained standing at the entrance. The room beyond was far larger than an ordinary classroom. Several rows of seats had been arranged in a raised semicircle facing a teacher's platform at the front. Behind it, a large runic screen occupied most of the wall, currently displaying the Academy's emblem. I must be the first one. There was no one else around. She had arrived nearly half an hour early. The previous night, she had been unable to sleep. One of her friends had eventually given her a sleeping potion, but even then, she had woken up early, groggy and anxious. Panicked about being late, she had hurried here as quickly as possible, only to discover that no one else had arrived yet. Isn't this a lecture hall? Aren't there only supposed to be 4 other people? Her brother Roland had informed her that today would be the first gathering of the group selected to participate in the treasure hunt. It was intended to give them an opportunity to meet before the competition, which offered a substantial number of points for their institute. It felt as though a swarm of butterflies had taken residence in her stomach. For a moment, she wondered if she should call the whole thing off. She had acted brave when speaking with her brother, but now that the task was directly before her, she was getting cold feet. What if the other students don't like me? My level is rather low. Fortunately, the competition was restricted to Tier 1 participants, but she still worried that the others would have much higher levels than hers. Unlike them, she had spent more time training her skills than fighting monsters, even though gaining levels would eventually become necessary. Brother Roland said he could help us gain higher levels later, so it should be fine. Finally, she let out a sigh and chose a seat close to the teacher's platform. Settling into the second row, Lucienne tried to calm herself. The room felt much larger when empty. Every sound seemed amplified. A moment later, she heard faint footsteps coming from the corridor she had just entered through. Someone was approaching. Excuse me. The voice was high-pitched and belonged to a girl who looked close to her age. She wore a long robe that extended well past the length of a standard academy uniform, its sleeves nearly covering her hands. Silver thread embroidered the fabric alongside the institute's emblem. To complete the image of a traditional wizard, she wore an enormous pointed hat that bent slightly to one side. Her hair was also an unusual shade of purple, likely altered through magic. Oh! The girl seemed surprised to find someone already inside. I thought I would be the first one here. Lucienne quickly stood up. And no, I just arrived a little early. She nervously shook her head as the girl looked her over. After a moment, the girl's expression softened into a smile, and she stepped closer. Let me introduce myself. My name is Selphie Asteril. The girl performed a small bow. At that exact moment, her oversized hat slipped forward in an awkward fashion. She caught it before it could hit the floor, fumbling with it for several seconds. The sight almost made Lucienne laugh. The last name sounded familiar. She was fairly certain she had heard it before, or perhaps seen it somewhere within the institute. Asteril, wait, aren't you the student who managed to hold the top spot in every theoretical exam for several years in a row? The girl blushed slightly when Lucienne recognized her name. She grabbed the brim of her oversized hat and pulled it down over her face, seemingly embarrassed to be recognized. Why yes, that's me. You're really famous. No, I'm not, stop it. She fidgeted as Lucienne continued to praise her. The girl was fairly well known around the institute as one of its top students in magical theory. Thanks to her outstanding grades, she had even been given a private room. It was no surprise that Lucienne, who lived in the dormitory, had never met her before. I'm Lucienne Arden. It's a pleasure to meet you. The girl seemed increasingly uncomfortable, so Lucienne decided to change the subject. Arden? I think I've heard that name somewhere. Ah. The incidents involving the deputy professor. Ah. Lucienne awkwardly scratched the back of her neck. It seemed the notoriety she had gained from those incidents had spread throughout the institute. Between us, I never really liked that bully Viola. She even made me do her homework. The girl pushed her hat back up and revealed a bright smile. Viola used to bully you, too. She was terrible. One time, she made me do homework for all of her friends as well. It was so unfair, but I couldn't do anything about it. Not until Deputy Professor Wayland arrived. Isn't he so dreamy? Dreamy. The moment her brother's name came up, little stars seemed to appear in Selphie's eyes. Fortunately, before the girl could start saying anything even more awkward about him, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Lucienne noticed it first. Selphie had been in the middle of talking about Deputy Professor Wayland when her voice trailed off. She tilted her head toward the entrance, and the door slid open once more. A young man stepped inside. He was unusually large for a mage. Standing well over 2 meters tall, he looked more like a warrior than a scholar. His robe seemed ready to split at the seams from the sheer size of his muscles. His skin was dark, and his red eyes gave him an intimidating appearance. Oh, another participant. Selphie waved at him, but he did not respond. The young man glanced toward the teacher's platform, then at the two girls. Without saying a word, he simply nodded before heading past them toward the back of the lecture hall. Lucienne and Selphie exchanged an awkward look, neither quite sure how to react. Maybe he's shy. Lucienne nodded. Perhaps that's the case. How about we take our seats and wait for the deputy professor? Sure. This spot is free. Selphie nodded and sat down beside Lucienne, carefully adjusting her oversized hat so it would not slip forward again. The two resumed chatting in quieter voices. This time, Selphie seemed to know who the muscular young man was. I think I know who that is. He's famous around the institute too. He is. Yes. It must be the muscle-brained mage. Muscle-brained mage? What kind of nickname is that? You've never heard of him? Supposedly, he spends all his time training in a special facility filled with weights and other heavy equipment. They say he trains there for 10 hours every day. That much training. Lucienne glanced back at the muscle-bound youth. He had the physique of a member of the Goliath race, yet he appeared to be an ordinary human. The mana surrounding him was unusually dense for someone who was only a Tier 1 class holder. He does seem dependable, though. Selphie nodded in agreement. Well, if he made it into the treasure hunt, he must be one of the best. With that, 3 people had gathered, and only 2 more remained. The next person arrived a short while later, about 10 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. It was another boy, this one of average height and build, yet just as distinct as the others. His robe had been modified with a large hood that he kept pulled over his head. A cloth covered the lower half of his face, leaving only a glimpse of black hair and a pair of auburn eyes visible. He looked gloomy and difficult to approach, so the 2 girls decided against speaking to him. The newcomer did not acknowledge them. Instead, he surveyed the room with a cold, analytical gaze before choosing a seat on the opposite side of the lecture hall, as far from both the muscular student and the 2 girls as possible. Well, he certainly seems friendly. Selphie whispered, leaning closer to Lucienne so her voice would not carry across the silent room. That makes 4 of us. Only 1 more left. Lucienne nodded, her gaze lingering on the hooded boy for a moment before returning to the entrance. The butterflies in her stomach never faded. If anything, they only grew stronger as she considered the unusual talents gathered here. There was the top student, a physical anomaly, and a boy whose presence seemed to disappear entirely whenever he wished to go unnoticed. The minutes ticked by, and the silence stretched on until the heavy clock on the wall rang out. Right on cue, the sliding door activated once more. Expecting the fifth student, everyone turned toward the entrance, but instead, a familiar figure stepped through. Oh! Lucienne blinked. It was not the final participant who had arrived, but her brother. Roland carried himself with quiet authority. He wore metallic armor partially concealed beneath thin robes. His expression was unreadable behind a helmet whose visor emitted a faint glow. Behind him, the door slid shut with a soft click and automatically locked to prevent interruptions. He strode toward the instructor's platform with measured steps, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor. Upon reaching the center, he set down a thick stack of papers and looked around the room. "Welcome." Roland spoke in a calm, clear voice that immediately commanded everyone's attention. "I am Deputy Professor Wayland. As you are all aware, you have been selected to represent our institute at the upcoming convocation, specifically in the Tier 1 treasure hunt event." Selfa looked as though she might burst with excitement, her oversized hat bobbing as she leaned forward in her seat. Lucienne did her best to maintain a composed, professional expression. She wanted to show her brother that she was taking this opportunity seriously. At the back of the room, the muscular student sat perfectly still. The hooded boy merely raised his head slightly. "Before we begin, it seems that one student is missing. Does anyone know where Elian Plomic is?" The question hung in the air for a moment, unanswered. Selfa looked at Lucienne, who responded with a shrug. Neither of them had any idea who the fifth student was supposed to be. Before anyone could speak up, a faint knocking sound echoed from behind the door that had locked itself. That was not all. They could also hear someone trying to slide it open, only to fail repeatedly. Everyone's gaze shifted toward the door, which suddenly slid open as Wayland seemingly released the lock. The moment it opened, a person tumbled through. Just before his nose could hit the floor, a mage hand spell caught him. "Ack! So this must be Elian." The deputy professor spoke in a low tone while the other students watched, unsure how to react. The boy hovered a few inches above the floor, suspended by the invisible force of Roland's spell, his limbs flailing like an overturned turtle. He was a scrawny youth with academy robes that were slightly singed at the cuffs. His messy copper hair stuck up in every possible direction. Smudges of charcoal dust covered his cheeks, making him look as though he had just escaped a minor laboratory explosion. With a flick of Roland's wrist, the spell vanished, dropping the boy unceremoniously onto his feet. "Why yes. Present." Elian hurriedly adjusted his collar and coughed into his hand to hide his embarrassment. "Apologies, Deputy Professor. I just had a minor accident while practicing a new spell. The mana matrix in the mana circle." Before he could continue, the teacher raised a hand to stop him. "Just take your seat, student. We still have a lot to cover today." Elian scrambled toward the nearest empty chair, his face burning a bright crimson that perfectly matched his copper hair. He practically threw himself into a seat in the third row, right behind Lucienne and Selfie, nearly banging his knees against the desk in the process. Once the latecomer settled down and the room quieted, Roland rested his gauntlet hands on the edge of the podium. The glowing visor of his helmet swept across the 5 students, lingering for a fraction of a second longer on his sister before moving on. "Now that everyone is present, let us begin," Roland announced. Even the 2 students in the back straightened up and listened. The muscular youth seemed particularly interested in what Roland had to say, as though he held some measure of respect for him. The convocation is not merely a test of individual magical power. The treasure hunt event is designed to simulate a hostile exploration environment. You will be deployed into a designated zone and tasked with locating specific magical artifacts while dealing with hazardous terrain, wild beasts, and, most importantly, teams from rival academies. He tapped the surface of the podium, and the large runic screen behind him flickered to life. The Academy's emblem vanished, replaced by 5 images of the students currently in the room. The students immediately wondered what this was about. Beside each image was a brief description, some far more revealing than others. "I'm support and utility, and you're the Pathfinder Scout." Selfie mumbled as she read the words beneath her and Lucienne's pictures. They could also see the names of the other 2 students. The muscle-bound one had the roles of tank and protector, and his name was Oxian Goodwill. The gloomy-looking youth was their flex and side DPS, and his name was Laren Vagarinard. Then there was Elian's position, which had main DPS written beneath it. None of them knew what it all meant, but the professor was about to explain. These designations represent your optimal roles within the team structure. Roland explained, his voice projecting clearly throughout the hall. Based on training data, historical exam results, and the specialized skill sets provided by the administration, this combination offers the highest probability of success. He tapped the podium again. The images on the screen shifted, replaced by a complex schematic of a standard 5-person exploration unit. The formation was quite simple. Selphie and Lucienne stood in the middle, with the boys surrounding them on 3 sides. Their tank occupied the front line, the main DPS stood directly behind him, and the side DPS covered the rear. The greatest mistake mages make in early combat is assuming that individual firepower dictates the outcome of a battle. A team of 5 powerful glass cannons will always lose to a balanced squad that understands positioning and role fulfillment. In a hostile zone, balance is what secures victory. Are there any questions, or can we move on? Roland paused, and one of the students raised his hand. It was Elian. Sir, if I may. Go ahead. Then, could you explain what a main DPS is and what a glass cannon is? The other students were also confused by some of the terms being used and were eager to hear the answer. They turned their attention back to the teacher's platform, curious to learn the meaning of these unfamiliar expressions. Why are their gazes so intense? Roland began to wonder if he should have paid more attention to the sensibilities of this world. Still, he preferred using terms from the modern world over the ones commonly used here. The group before him was anything but conventional. Most teams sent into these competitions consisted of several similarly powerful mages accompanied by a single tracker. Roland had decided to take a different approach. Each person had a very specific role to fulfill, and some of these children, much like his sister, possessed unusual classes that were rarely seen or properly utilized. The thin copper-haired youth was one such example. His affinity for the fire element was exceptional, making him the ideal choice for an AoE mage and the primary damage dealer of the group. Oxian, on the other hand, came from a long line of specialized earth mages who strengthened their bodies until they became living weapons clad in stone. Laren, whose presence was naturally subdued, was an assassin type, proficient in surprise attacks and illusion magic. Then there was Selphie, a girl whose intellect was likely equal to Roland's at her age, perhaps even greater. She was the all-rounder of the group, capable of handling almost any situation and familiar with nearly every utility spell available at her tier. This was the team that would be taking part in the treasure hunt, and his task of preparing them for it had finally begun. That about covers the fundamentals of our strategy. Roland finished his presentation and turned to face the 5 people before him. Their reactions varied. The muscular youth at the back had a glazed look in his eyes, as if he had understood almost nothing that had been said. Selphie, on the other hand, had somehow managed to produce a mountain of notes. A stack of papers sat in front of her, all of which she had pulled directly from her oversized hat, which also functioned as a spatial bag. His sister seemed a little lost as well, and Elian wore a concerned expression. The only one Roland could not quite read was Laren, who continued to look at him with the same passive expression. Even though all of them were mages, that did not mean they shared the same understanding of every subject. The intelligence stat helped with memorization, but it did little for practical application, especially in the chaos of a real battlefield. Roland tapped the podium one last time, causing the runic screen to fade back into the Academy emblem. He glanced at Oxian, whose blank stare suggested he was still unsure of what he had just witnessed. In short, Roland had laid out their objectives and explained which branches of magic each of them needed to focus on. Most children their age wanted nothing more than to jump into the fray and unleash the most eye-catching spells they could muster. He, however, had asked for restraint. The tank needed to be an immovable wall focused on defense rather than offense, which seemed to run contrary to Oxian's instincts. The tactics should be sound, but getting these kids to follow orders might be difficult. Oxian was one concern, but Elian was another, and much of their strategy depended on him. He possessed a special class known as the Spark Mage. Normally, elemental mage classes only became available at Tier 2, but there were exceptions. This class was similar to Roland's own runic blacksmith class, which allowed him to enchant equipment with runes, something that should not have been possible at Tier 1. The same principle applied here. Elian could cast Tier 1 fire spells with far greater potency than any ordinary Tier 1 mage, making him the ideal choice for the group's primary damage dealer. However, despite his talent, he still needed time to cast those spells and required protection from the others while doing so. Laren had not voiced any complaints, and Roland could not glean much from his expression, but he was fairly certain the youth understood his role, to distract enemies and eliminate anyone who managed to break through their defensive line. You will all begin practical training after familiarizing yourselves with the strategy guides. He snapped his fingers, activating one of his spatial runes. 5 booklets emerged from within, accompanied by several rectangular metal plates engraved with runes. Your strategy guide is marked with your name and assigned position. These runic memory cards can be used at one of the newest facilities within our runic department. Go there and ask one of the assistant professors to help you access the training modules stored inside. Roland flicked his wrist, and the 5 metallic cards, along with the notebooks, floated down onto a table to be collected. For this first gathering, this was all he had to offer. He knew the students had many questions, but his time was extremely limited. As a result, he drew on lessons from his own college days and designed the program so the students would study most of the material on their own. The strategy guide included everything they needed to know. It outlined the various spells and combinations they should focus on, detailed which spells should be practiced together, specified the timing of their casting windows, and described the formations they were expected to maintain during engagements. Roland had essentially condensed complex squad tactics into a compact manual. The runic memory sticks he had brought could be connected to runic monitors to display battle formations for practice. They also contained visual representations of possible combat scenarios, making the material easier to understand. The assistant professors and other instructors had been given similar guides, which they would later use to evaluate the students. Roland would not be their primary instructor, as this group of 5 was only one among many that required guidance. His role was to formulate strategies and contingency plans for each group while addressing the most common challenges they were likely to encounter. The overall plan was ambitious in scope but simple in execution. For the first few months, every student would train exclusively within their assigned group. Once their teamwork had improved, they would be given access to support spellcasting devices. It was important that they first learn to operate without them so they would not become overly dependent on the increased mana reserves those devices provided. Now then, pick up your guide. For any further guidance, please consult Professor Arian or any other assistant professor from the runic department. Roland still had many more groups like this to meet. Thanks to the scanner and the sorting system, they could identify the most effective student combinations for every event. This allowed him to map out optimal team compositions in a fraction of the time traditional observation would require. However, it also meant that he was almost single-handedly drafting the strategic blueprint for the Institute's entire convocation roster. The pressure on his shoulders was immense, and as always, his nights had grown short. The 5 students sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing the abrupt dismissal. Elian moved first, carefully reaching for the booklet and the metallic card resting on top of it. The moment his fingers brushed the card, its runes emitted a faint crimson glow, as though responding to his strong affinity for fire magic. "We just go to the runic department?" Elian asked, his voice cracking slightly before he straightened his posture. "And these cards will just show us what to do. They will provide visual simulations of your designated positions and provide aid in spell priority," Roland replied, adjusting the gauntlet on his left wrist. "The assistants will configure the runic monitors to project the formations, and a training facility will be modified for your use. Once you have become accustomed to working with your group, we will proceed to true life training exercises." True life training? Elian gulped at Roland's words. "Just training in a dungeon against specialized golems that recreate the tactics commonly seen during previous convocations." The other students eventually moved on without asking any further questions, as Elian had already raised the points most of them were curious about. It was clear they had little experience with this sort of rigid training, but none of them voiced any objections. Oxian Goodwill scooped up his thick booklet and card with a single massive hand. His expression remained somewhat blank, but the confusion had been replaced by raw determination. Like before, he simply nodded and headed for the exit. Laren suddenly appeared from behind the large youth's shadow as though he had been waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Roland could tell he was using a combination of illusion and concealment spells to make himself difficult to notice. It seemed he was diligent enough to train his mana capacity even inside a classroom. Or perhaps he simply disliked being noticed. Like the previous student, he took the booklet and quickly disappeared through the exit. Elian was the third to collect his materials, and he nearly stumbled over his own feet as he hurried away. "Selfie, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement. She grabbed her booklet and card before immediately flipping through the strategy guide, unable to contain her curiosity. Her eyes raced across the strategies and diagrams even as she walked toward the door. Predictably, she walked straight into the wall beside the exit, knocking her hat off in the process. Aha! She let out an awkward chuckle, picked up the hat, and placed it back on her head before turning toward Lucienne. I'll see you around, Lucienne. Yes. Lucienne nodded, though she was probably wondering whether her new friend was all right after hitting her forehead. Even so, she seemed far more interested in the strategy guide. As the last member of the group, she stepped forward and accepted it. She looked at Roland. It was obvious she wanted to say something, but under the circumstances, she needed to act like a student rather than his younger sister. She hesitated for a moment. Her fingers tightened around the guide, and she pressed it against her chest while looking at her brother. Thank you, Deputy Professor. We will not let the Institute down. Roland gave a slight nod, and soon she departed from the lecture room. He barely had time to appreciate the silence. Only 5 minutes later, another group of students arrived. This group was larger, as its members would be participating in multiple competitions. Not every event was the same. The treasure hunt was one of the longest competitions and required a separate team for each age bracket. Later, he would meet the students competing in the 18-year-old category, all of whom were Tier 2 class holders. First, however, he needed to distribute more strategy guides to this group and explain how information would be provided through the runic department. This is going to take most of my day. He frowned behind his helmet, but it was a task that needed to be done. The hours passed as he continued explaining everything to the students. His experience was very different from when he had first arrived at the institute. Back then, few people listened to him, and many did not even know he existed. Now, however, it was clear he had earned a great deal of respect from the students. Or perhaps they were simply afraid he would knock some sense into them if they stepped out of line. That's all of them. Roland stretched his arms, the plates of his gauntlets sliding over one another with a crisp metallic click. The heavy silence of the empty lecture hall was a welcome relief after hours of magically projecting his voice and explaining unfamiliar terminology. He walked back to the instructor's platform to shut down the monitor he had been using. As the screen flickered out, he could not help but notice how his presence in this world was affecting everything around him. It had started with the monitoring system, and once it was introduced, the screens it used quickly became popular among the teachers. They consumed far less mana than the large illusion matrices that produced three-dimensional images, which were often blurry and lacked detail. The monitors resembled modern television screens that were approaching high-definition quality, though they still had some way to go. Color reproduction also needed further refinement, but despite their shortcomings, they had become the preferred teaching tool at the institute. Roland stepped outside, contemplating the future and the changes he was bringing to this world. The people here were different, and so was their culture, but in many ways they were not so unlike the people from his old world. Everyone wanted a better future for themselves or sought to protect what they already had. It was a universal truth, regardless of whether someone carried a smartphone or wielded a staff to channel mana. Is this truly the right path, and what will happen if this technology spreads throughout the kingdom? Lost in thought, he eventually arrived at the runic department, which was bustling with activity. Many of the students he had instructed earlier were gathered there, seeking guidance. Even the stuttering assistant teacher was being swarmed with questions and seemed to have more work than anyone else. Well, it does not really matter what path the people of this world choose. That is not my problem. Everything he created was meant to make life easier for himself and the people he cared about. Whether his inventions would ultimately improve the world or make it worse was not a concern he could afford to dwell on. As long as he could carve out a peaceful life and gain the strength to protect it with his own 2 hands, that was enough. Deputy Professor Wayland. Could you help me with a small conundrum? Sure, but I was planning to leave soon. I still have a few other things to take care of. Arian came flying over with a worried expression on his feline face. Although he was delighted by the success of the runic department, it was clear they had taken on a tremendous responsibility. The workload had increased exponentially, and they were struggling to manage the sudden influx of students. Please, it will only take a moment. Arian pleaded, his tail twitching anxiously. The third-year groups are trying to initialize their memory cards at the same time, and the central runic matrix is experiencing severe mana backlash. The monitors are flickering, and I am terrified the entire system might collapse. At this rate, the runic cables could melt. Roland sighed under his breath, but he knew it was better to deal with this problem now than to come back later when it was too late. Many of the assistants lacked the fundamental understanding required to use the runic equipment he had created, and the dwarven craftsmen responsible for producing it were still new to the process. He was also the one who crammed everything into a single day, likely overloading the entire system when all the students attempted to activate their memory cards at once. Although he knew about the limitations, he failed to anticipate the students' curiosity. "Let's go then. I'll head to the primary distribution junction first." Roland's words nearly brought Arian to tears with relief. What followed was a lengthy tour of the institute, fixing minor strains throughout the system and spending far more time on the task than he had originally intended. As he worked, he could not help but wonder if the headmistress had somehow tricked him. Now that he was stuck reinforcing runic cabling throughout the academy, giving a 1-hour lecture each week no longer seemed like such a terrible arrangement. Instead, he was spending the next half-year doing all the heavy lifting to win the competition, and if he failed to place well, he would still end up lecturing the brats afterward. Will I be stuck here until I reach Tier 4 myself? The thought crossed his mind as he glanced at the moons shining brightly through the windows while making his way through the halls. More than anything, he wanted to return home, take a hot bath, and get some sleep before diving back into his demanding schedule. However, as he continued down the corridor, he sensed someone approaching from ahead. The presence belonged to a figure of considerable importance within the academy. Deputy Professor Wayland. Good day, or should I say good evening instead. Standing before him was Rithos, the vice-headmaster of the institute. His appearance had not changed, still resembling the iconic wizard from the old tales of Roland's home world. The old man stood tall, his long silver beard catching the faint glow of the luminescent crystals lining the hallway. His deep blue robes were immaculate, completely free of dust or wrinkles despite the late hour. Rithos carried himself with an air of not only authority but also as the prime example of what a mage should be. In many ways, he was the law within the institute, as the headmistress rarely involved herself in its day-to-day affairs. "Good evening, Vice-Headmaster Rithos," Roland replied while quietly assessing the situation. "I was just finishing some emergency maintenance in the runic department." Rithos smiled, his expression polite yet impossible to read. He slowly stroked his beard, his gaze lingering on the intricate runic engravings covering Roland's gauntlets and armor. "Ah, yes. I heard the headmistress tasked you with selecting the convocation roster and managing the students. I hope you are feeling confident." Roland remained still, wondering if there was some hidden meaning behind the words. Normally, the other departments would have been involved and offered assistance, but the headmistress had closed off that possibility. It would not be surprising if the vice-headmaster felt his position was being challenged, considering he had long been the de facto authority around the institute. "Yes, sir. The runic department will do its best to achieve good results in the coming convocation." "I see. Then I won't keep you any longer from your well-deserved rest." Rithos stepped aside, opening the path down the corridor. His smile never wavered, and he looked every bit the image of a kindly old wizard. He had helped Roland during the Viola incident, so Roland chose not to dwell on the questions and simply continued on his way. "The old man is probably just worried about whether I'm doing a good job, or perhaps unhappy that the headmistress made this decision without consulting him." Roland did not think much of it and continued toward the teleportation gate. While his work at the institute was finished for the time being, other responsibilities awaited him back home. Click. "I think I'm getting used to this new cockpit, but is there something wrong? I think we managed to improve the response time, so it should feel much more natural now. Were there any problems?" No, everything is fine. I was just thinking, are you taking care of yourself, brother?" "Taking care of myself?" Roland stopped looking at the panels as his brother moved closer. He was wearing his mobile runic armor pilot suit, which was essentially a modified silver grace suit. The two had been focused on the cockpit, trying to improve the frame's reaction time, but Robert seemed to have noticed something else. "Yes. Your eyes look kind of vacant. Have you been sleeping enough lately?" Roland blinked and pulled his gaze away from the runic diagnostic screen. The monitor's pale blue glow reflected in his tired eyes. He raised a hand and rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the exhaustion that had settled deep within him over the past few weeks. "I sleep as much as necessary, Robert. There is simply a large amount of work that requires my direct supervision at the moment. If you say so, but perhaps you should take a day off, or at least half a day, to recover some strength." As they say, no kingdom was built in a day, but many who tried were buried under the shaky foundation. There were old sayings in this world as well, and now that he had his older brother here, he was hearing them more often. Robert was slowly becoming more comfortable speaking his mind. In the past, he had usually remained silent. Really, I'm fine. This isn't the first time I've had to work for a few extra days. After a nap, I'll be fully recovered. You know how resilient the body of a Tier 3 class holder can be. That may be true, but it would be better not to rely too much on that or on magic. When your mind isn't focused, accidents happen. Roland nodded. He had to admit that when he spread himself too thin, calculations that normally took a few minutes could end up taking half an hour. There were diminishing returns to pushing himself this hard. Still, he felt as though he could not afford much rest. Today, however, perhaps it was better to listen to his older brother. Perhaps you are right, brother. Let's call it a day. Ha! Splendid. You won't regret it. Robert seemed to brighten immediately after hearing him agree. As Roland prepared to leave for the night, he found himself asking a question. How is our sister faring these days? Roland closed the door leading to the runic golem chamber and turned toward Robert. Lucienne? Oh, she is doing fine. Somewhat. Somewhat? Are there any problems? Did something happen? Robert reacted exactly as a concerned brother would, but Roland quickly stopped him before he could jump to the wrong conclusion. Everything is fine. It's just that the new group she joined still needs some time to adjust. The team has been trying to implement the new squad tactics, but the synergy isn't there yet. It's hard to make 5 completely different people work as a single unit, and in this particular case, some of them are rather peculiar kids. It had been a few weeks since he held the initial meeting, and things were progressing at a steady pace. He had explained the roles and given everyone time to familiarize themselves with the strategy, but some were not particularly happy with their assignments. Peculiar? Is it something dangerous? Oh, it's nothing like that. It's just that some of them aren't adapting to their roles very well, and the assistant professors are apparently having trouble directing them. Which means I might have to go there in person. Roland let out a sigh as he recalled reading the reports from the first few training sessions. Every student was different, and some of those he had selected for the group with his sister were particularly headstrong. Well, it's not all bad. One girl is quite exceptional, and it seems she and Lucienne are becoming friends. But it would be better if she told you about it herself when the two of you meet. Robert stopped in his tracks at the mention of seeing her again. There were still about 5 months left before the event, but it was obvious he was eager to reunite with his sister. Perhaps we can even arrange a meeting with your mother. We'll just have to do it after the competition ends. Roland patted Robert on the shoulder. The problem with meeting Francine was the possibility that she might try to take her son back to the Arden estate. For now, she believed he had left the kingdom to run away with his new fiancé, but if she met him in person, there was no telling what she might do. Well, I'll follow your advice, brother. Have a safe trip back. Ah, yes. I'll be off then. Robert nodded and left the workshop, just as he always did. The train ride that had once taken an hour now lasted only 50 minutes thanks to several upgrades made to the runic train, making the commute to the workshop much easier. After watching him disappear through one of the heavy doors, Roland headed for the elevator and made his way outside. He had been busy for the last few days, and he could already tell that the coming months would be exhausting. Tonight, however, he could spend some time with his wife, who, as always, was concerned about his health. I'll be heading out. Try not to overwork yourself. I would never. You know me. Morning came quickly, and Roland chuckled while his wife, Elydia, frowned at him. She knew better than to believe that. During this period, the two of them had far less time together than before because they were both busy. The new school for children had become far more popular than anyone had anticipated. Many parents were eager for their children to learn how to read and write and to gain basic mathematical skills. The work demanded a great deal of time, and Elydia now spent more of her days at the school than she ever did at their shop. It had, regrettably, gradually become something of an afterthought. It was a little disheartening to see the runic shop, which had once been his first major goal, reduced to something managed almost entirely by hired workers. With so many other projects demanding his attention, he rarely had time to stock or oversee it himself. Most of the time, he had Bernier create the bulk of everything. Then, once a week, he used the rune copy skill to quickly apply a few simple enchantments. The finished products were still of high quality, but they were not something that could truly be praised as exceptional. Nevertheless, he could not worry about that right now. First, he needed to finish his other projects, some of which also involved Arthur's mother. Always the sarcastic one. Just take care of yourself. I will. They parted with a kiss, and soon someone else demanded his attention as Agni pushed his large snout through the window. Woof. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you, big guy. In just 2 or 3 months, you should be there. Awoo. Agni nuzzled Roland's palm, his thick fur radiating a comforting warmth. The wolf had grown over the years, and his intelligence seemed to have grown alongside it. He was now about a quarter of a head taller than when he had first reached this stage of evolution, and he was likely approaching the limit of his growth. I hope you won't get much larger than this. Otherwise, we'll have to expand your doghouse, and getting through some dungeons will become a problem. Agni's strength could not be denied, but if he grew as large as the legendary Fenrir, he would no longer fit through some dungeon corridors. Out in the Lesser Draconic Valley, his size was not an issue. However, bringing him into hidden temples or other smaller enclosed structures would certainly become problematic. Well then, I've had my rest, so let's get back to it. Lately, he had been working for 3 days straight before taking a single day to rest. To most people, it would have looked like a suicidal schedule, but with his sleep resistance skill maxed out, 1 day was enough to recover his stamina and avoid any serious drawbacks. Let's go then. You've got me for the rest of the day, Agni. Let's make it count. Woof. With that, the two headed back into the workshop and used the gate to return to the underground temple where the undead lesser dragons wandered. Even though they could slaughter many of them in a short amount of time, the experience required to gain levels continued to increase. By now, Roland was certain that he would not reach the level needed for a new class before the convocation arrived. The amount of experience required to obtain a secondary Tier 3 class was staggering. Many people never reached that point and became stuck somewhere around level 200. However, some were different. Just like Roland and Agni, their progress was rapid, almost too rapid for some to accept. The skeletal lesser dragons lurking in the subterranean depths turned to dust beneath Agni's flames and Roland's fiery barrage. The fighting had become routine, reminding him of grinding in the games he had played in his previous life. There was always a route that offered the most experience in the shortest amount of time, and thanks to mapping the entire area, he knew exactly which path to take. That boss chamber never recovered, though. Woof. I know, Agni. Let's head back. The route ended at a vantage point overlooking the chasm leading to the boss chamber. It was better to turn back than attempt to cross it. Without a boss on the other side, there was nothing to gain in terms of experience or loot. The egg he had taken was still absorbing Agni's pure mana, and he had no idea when it would hatch, or even if it ever would. By the time they returned to the gate, more than half a day had passed. This had become almost a daily routine. After clearing out all the monsters, it took another day for them to respawn. While they could always head out and blow up sea serpents, this remained the most efficient approach for now, especially since Roland still needed time for other projects. One in particular was something he would have preferred to avoid, but could not. Back to the institute again. I really drew the short straw with this one, didn't I? After returning to the workshop, he changed into his professor's armor and stepped through the gate. As he had done countless times before, he nodded to those who bowed in greeting. The shift from his quiet workshop to the bustling mage institute, filled with talkative youths and magical creatures running and flying about, was something he never truly got used to. Just as he had his own training and Agni's to oversee, he also had responsibilities here. His original plan had been to leave most of the teaching to the assistant instructors by providing them with detailed handbooks outlining the tactics students should practice. However, after about a month, he realized things would not be nearly as straightforward as he had expected. Mages aren't like soldiers. Back in Albrook, he was the High Knight Commander, and people followed his orders without question. Many of these students, however, were remarkably stubborn. Some refused to follow instructions altogether, while others demanded answers to 100 questions before they would even consider moving. It was an entirely different environment, and Roland was beginning to understand that a standard manual was useless when dealing with a room full of eccentric, highborn teenagers convinced they already knew everything about magic. He made his way toward the specialized training grounds beneath the main campus. The area had been retrofitted with reinforced runic barriers designed to absorb spells, making it the perfect place for students to practice group coordination without accidentally blowing up part of the academy. Deputy Professor. Over here. Arian waved at him with a small cat paw while floating in the air. He was already waiting for him, and beside him stood several dwarves from the runic department. At the moment, they were repairing a collection of white puppets that reminded Roland of the crash test dummies from his previous world, except these were completely white. How are the teams doing? He nodded to both the dwarven craftsman and Arian. Why don't you see for yourself, my friend? Roland turned toward the array of runic monitors. 8 of them were arranged side by side and stacked atop one another, each displaying a different training exercise. Some showed students from various age groups navigating simulated labyrinths, while others focused entirely on target practice. His gaze immediately settled on the screen displaying the 16-year-old group, the team that included his younger sister in the upcoming treasure hunt. This looks like a complete mess. The group was facing 6 white puppets created for this exercise. However, these were no ordinary constructs. They could assume the illusory forms of other mages and imitate the abilities of both monsters and mages up to Tier 2. You shall not escape. Oxian Goodwill, who usually remained silent, shouted as he encased his body in a layer of sand and rock. Even though he was still a Tier 1 class holder, his affinity for earth-based body enhancement magic was staggering. His role was supposed to be that of a tank, but as on many previous occasions, instead of watching over his team, he charged after a lone puppet. It was clearly a distraction meant to lure him away from the group. As a result, Elian was left exposed to a barrage of mana bolts, which were much easier to cast than more advanced spells. Fire Ro, Ak. Elian dove to the side as the bolts of mana zipped past him. They were not strong enough to injure him, but if they struck his body, the impact would still leave him badly stunned. Fortunately, there was still one competent member of the team. Selpha quickly raised a mana shield to protect him, while Lucienne held her position near the center of the formation. At first glance, Laren appeared to be performing well. Using a combination of stealth and illusion magic, he slipped behind the puppet mages. He successfully ambushed them and even managed to eliminate one with a quick spell. However, he completely ignored the larger battle unfolding around him. While 3 of his teammates were under attack, he remained focused on a single target that was not particularly important to the enemy formation. It was a clear demonstration of the young man's poor target prioritization. Roland tapped his fingers against his forearm as he watched the tactical display. The lack of cohesion was painful to witness. It was like watching a group of players in a game, each determined to be the hero while remaining completely oblivious to the teammate who was about to be eliminated. Maybe if this were some kind of team deathmatch, this would work, but if they lose their tracker, they won't be able to find any treasure. He shook his head and initiated the shutdown procedure for the training chamber occupied by the 5 youths. The puppets froze instantly, and their illusory forms faded away to reveal their true bodies beneath. The environment around the youths shifted as well, the chamber's magic restoring everything to its original state. It's still quite a sight, even after seeing it so many times. It may not be on the level of Tier 4 magic, but it can reshape the environment to simulate a wide variety of scenarios. These training facilities had existed long before Roland arrived. Normally, they were reserved for mages deemed worthy enough to use them in a controlled environment. However, they were far from perfect. It was only after the addition of the golemic puppets that the training chambers truly became exceptional. With the runic department programming their behavior, they could simulate combat scenarios with an unprecedented degree of realism. Ah, he did it again. Arian chuckled as he watched Oxian punch one of the stationary puppets while it was still in the process of shutting down. He certainly has a fiery temper. Roland wondered whether he had made a mistake when selecting some of these recruits. Their abilities suited the task, but their personalities often worked against the team. I'm sure you can rein them in, my friend. I'll try. Roland sighed and headed toward the chamber. The only one who truly required little guidance was Selphie. His sister was struggling as well. More often than not, she became a burden to the team because she could neither defend herself properly nor keep her composure during live combat. Still, he intended to remedy their shortcomings through harsher and more focused training. The heavy reinforced doors of the training chamber slid open with a hiss. Inside, the air was cool thanks to the filtration system that had been installed recently. A lone figure stood in the doorway, one that had previously been almost invisible to the naked eye. It's always fascinating to see these spaces once you step inside. Roland entered the training chamber beneath the institute. There had been little room to build below the structure, but thanks to spatial magic, the area was many times larger than it appeared from the outside. What should have been a chamber of roughly 100 square meters had been expanded into a space several football fields across, providing more than enough room for students to practice their magic. As he stepped forward, the space around him unfolded into a vast expanse. In the distance, he spotted Oxian standing over a deactivated puppet. Its head rested in his large hand after being punched clean off. The young man was trying to reattach it, but each attempt ended the same way, with the head slipping free and falling back to the ground. Professor Elian was the first to notice Roland's arrival. He immediately straightened his posture and tried to look presentable despite being out of breath. The other teenagers quickly followed suit, abandoning their post-battle squabbles. Oxian discreetly kicked the detached puppet head beneath a nearby bench that had appeared once the illusory scenery vanished. Without the illusion magic, the surrounding space was almost entirely empty. Enchanted symbols covered every surface. The room itself was one enormous runic construct, designed to generate solid illusions that recreated terrain, rocks, and scenery. The assembled puppets then simulated monsters and other hostile opponents. With everything deactivated, the chamber resembled a massive hangar. The spatial enchantment remained active at all times and formed the foundation of the entire structure. The illusion magic had been layered on top of it after the space was expanded. If the spatial enchantment were ever removed, the chamber would collapse back into its original dimensions, and the illusion arrays would have to be forged again from scratch. Maintaining the facility required a constant supply of magical energy. Roland walked forward, his footsteps echoing through the vast chamber. He stopped a few paces from the group. His expression remained hidden behind his helmet, but his tone made his mood clear. He was not pleased. Oxian Goodwill. The purpose of a tank in a 5-man squad is to control the battlefield and maintain proper spacing while preventing enemies from reaching the back line. It is not to engage in a glorious duel with the first target that catches your eye. But Professor. Oxian grumbled and crossed his massive arms. Whatever eloquence he possessed seemed to vanish the moment the battle ended. Either he could not properly express his reasoning, or he simply did not know how to defend himself before a professor of Roland's caliber. You what? You left Elian exposed and unable to finish his chant. Oxian glared at Elian when Roland mentioned him. He said nothing, but his irritation was obvious. Roland suspected he blamed the other student for failing to complete the spell. There had still been enough time to cast it, but Elian had panicked. His chanting had also been painfully slow, riddled with hesitations and repeated stumbles over the words. An Elian Plomic. Roland turned his attention to the other young man, who visibly flinched when Roland looked at him. Your role as the primary DPS is useless if you cannot maintain your composure. A battle will never provide a sterile, quiet environment for you to chant your spells. If a single stray mana bolt causes you to fumble your words and stutter, then you are a liability to this entire team. I apologize, Deputy Professor. Elian muttered, looking down at his boots. The pressure. When the illusions intensify, it feels like everything is happening so fast. I cannot seem to keep the incantations straight in my head. Roland did not offer any immediate comfort. He was aware that these youths needed personalized training. Instead of forcing them to work as a group from the beginning, they first needed to understand their individual roles within the team. Oxian needed to feel as though he was losing ground whenever he allowed someone to slip past him, while Elian needed proper concentration and chanting exercises in mentally taxing situations. Yes, we will have to give all of you special training, but first, Laren Vogerinard, come out and stop hiding. Laren finally revealed himself. For some reason, he had been lying flat on the ground and had concealed himself perfectly within the scenery using illusion magic. The young man clearly knew he had made a mistake, and instead of apologizing, he had hidden away as though Roland would somehow forget about him. Just get over here. The only one among you who did an adequate job is Selfie Asteril. Lucien Arden, you also need to learn how to protect yourself. You are the main tracker, but knowing how to respond to attacks is something every mage should be capable of doing. Why yes, Deputy Professor. Even though she was his sister, he could not treat her differently. In fact, he had to be stricter to ensure she would not become a target during the actual competition. Lucien was just surprised. I am sure she will do better next time, Deputy Professor. Selfie defended her new friend, even though she was the only one who had avoided a scolding. Her large hat continued to slip lower as she stared at him with pleading eyes, making Roland wonder if he was the villain in this situation. Just gather together and stay here for now. We will start your special training right here and now. Roland pointed to the spot where the 5 students were to assemble. Fortunately, thanks to his reputation, they followed his orders without question. At least they did when he was present. Arian, remove the safety guards on this training chamber and give me full control. Through his helmet, he communicated with Arian and the runic department staff in the control room. The feline professor nodded, and after making a few adjustments to the runic operating system, the runes throughout the chamber began to shimmer. I have transferred all control to you, Deputy Professor. What are you planning to do? Arian was clearly curious. Just watch and see. This chamber has many features that people do not know about. You can even use them like this. Roland had spent a great deal of time researching within this institute and had personally helped build its monitoring system. As a result, he probably understood how everything worked in greater detail than many of the mages who had spent half their lives teaching here. What is the professor doing? Elian asked in a whisper to both Lucienne and Selphie. I don't know, but this amount of mana is tremendous. Selphie's hat almost slipped off her head again as she sensed a massive concentration of mana surrounding their teacher's armored figure. Even Oxian swallowed hard as he stood there gawking. Before them, the entire room began reacting without anything being visibly activated. It was as if the mana Roland was releasing was affecting every rune in the chamber. Some of them even seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. Illusion magic is quite handy in situations like this. The chamber began to transform, dividing itself into 4 separate sections. No machinery moved. The change was accomplished entirely through illusion magic. Although most people believed illusions only affected the mind, skilled practitioners could solidify them into tangible constructs capable of creating real environments. There were even legends of 4th and 5th tier mages who could create entire pocket realms through illusion magic, worlds that were indistinguishable from reality. What Roland was doing here was far less complex. He was simply creating smaller training areas within the chamber to give the troublemakers a proper environment to practice in. Shimmering walls of hardened illusion magic rose from the floor, dividing the massive hangar into 4 distinct, isolated zones. At first, light fractured through the semi-transparent barriers, but they soon solidified into rocky partitions. The illusions were not particularly durable. They resembled ordinary stone and could be broken by basic first-tier spells. However, when made thick enough, they served as effective barriers for young mages like these. Oh, the puppets. They're fixing themselves, is that also the power of a rune mage? While the others focused on the newly formed training rooms, Selphie noticed something else. The white puppet that had lost its head was repairing itself, and it was clearly being restored through their professor's mana. Before long, the puppets gathered together and began moving into the smaller chambers that had appeared. That should be enough. It took around 5 minutes for all the chambers to fully form. Each entrance was sealed off and fitted with what appeared to be an iron door. The students were clearly captivated by the massive spell that had transformed the entire area. For Roland, however, the feat was relatively simple. He was drawing not only on his own mana but also on the power of the institute itself. The institute was practically a magical power plant, sustained by numerous methods of generating mana. If Roland ever wanted to rival its output through technology alone, he would probably need to build a nuclear power plant. Elian Plomic. Ah, yes, Professor. Come with me. Elian was first. Selphie gave him a pat on the back while Lucienne simply smiled. Yes, sir. The two entered the first chamber. Once inside, Elian looked around in confusion, unsure of what exactly he was supposed to learn there. The room contained a circle in the center, walls lined with openings of various shapes and sizes, and several wooden practice dummies wearing robes at the far end. This is your training room. Stand in the middle and do not leave that circle. Once you get used to that space, it will begin to shrink. Why don't you give it a try? Cast one of your spells and hit one of those practice dummies. Of course, Professor. Elian did not ask for an explanation and simply carried out the orders. Not only did he struggle to focus, but he was also surprisingly timid when it came to listening to his professors and rarely asked too many questions. The young mage stepped into the center of the marked circle, his hands trembling slightly. Roland waited for him to begin chanting, and as soon as the boy's mana started taking shape into a spell, he activated the room's primary function. One of the holes in the wall began to glow. Without warning, just as Elian was about to complete the spell, a small ball of blue energy shot toward him. It moved quickly and, with no chance to react, struck him in the shoulder. A brief jolt of energy ran through his body. The pain was mild, but the numbing effect instantly disrupted the spell casting process. Your primary flaw is your lack of spatial awareness and your inability to concentrate while moving or under pressure. This chamber will fix that. Roland gestured toward the holes lining the walls and ceiling. Each of these openings contains a spell construct capable of targeting you with harmless but painful numbing jolts. Their frequency and speed will increase as you improve, until you can successfully cast without interruption. Your task is to destroy the target dummies as quickly as possible. If you step outside this circle, you will immediately fail the exercise, and it will reset. Elian looked at the dozens of openings surrounding him, his face growing slightly pale. But how do I know where the spell will come from, Deputy Professor? What should I do? Feel the mana as the spell forms. Once you can sense it, you will know where the attack is coming from. After that, avoiding it should be easy. Easy. Elian looked deeply uncomfortable as he stared at the countless holes in the walls. An attack could come from any direction and at any point during his casting. It was a difficult training method, but Roland did not have time for the boy to progress through the Institute's standard curriculum. There was little time left, and this was one of the fastest ways to improve his skills short of fighting real opponents. Now then, begin your training. I'll go tend to your teammates. Professor? You're leaving. Of course. Stay in here for the next hour and focus on hitting the dummies. You are not allowed to leave before then. But... The boy looked frightened, but Roland paid it little mind as he closed the door behind him. The chamber would not harm the youth. He simply needed to frighten him enough to ensure he took the training seriously. If Elian was struck too many times, the program would automatically shut down. It had also been designed to prevent actual injury, producing only a brief sensation of paralysis rather than any real damage. I suppose this would also be a good way to build resistance to paralysis. Roland considered this as he approached the main troublemaker, Oxian. The youth was taller than Roland himself, but his face still revealed his lack of experience. Oxian Goodwill, come with me. Your room is the next one. Oxian followed Roland into the second chamber without resisting or saying anything. The young man was quite heavy-footed. With each step he took, his boots clanked against the floor. Even now, he was using some sort of body-enhancing spell that surrounded him with a layer of rock. The chamber they arrived in was much longer than the one used by the previous youth. At the far end stood 3 wooden puppets that looked quite fragile. Along the sides were several other puppets, some designed for close combat and others capable of launching ranged attacks. Your training is simple. Roland gestured toward the wooden golemic puppets at the end of the chamber. You must escort those wooden puppets from the end of the room back to the entrance. However, the moment you approach them, the combat puppets will begin attacking. Some will focus on you, while others will target the people behind you. If any of those 3 wooden puppets are injured, you will fail. Oxian nodded, seemingly confident in his abilities. The scenario appeared simple, but it would likely prove challenging. He would need to match the pace of those he was protecting, something he had always struggled with. Begin. Roland watched as Oxian strode toward the puppets with a confident glint in his eye. It seemed he wanted to clear this test on his first attempt to prove himself, but just as Roland expected, he rushed in. Oxian charged ahead, the rocky armor around his limbs grinding together with a heavy scraping sound. He reached the 3 wooden puppets at the far end of the chamber and turned to face the attackers. The constructs began shuffling forward with slow, awkward steps that mimicked human movement. The moment they crossed a certain threshold into the main corridor, the opposing combat puppets sprang to life. One charged directly at Oxian and, as he had done many times before, he immediately focused on driving it back with all his strength. The golemic puppet was sent flying, but in the process, one of the wooden puppets behind him stumbled and was struck by a simple mana bolt cast by one of the mage puppets. You fail. Start from the beginning. Roland spoke as everything in the chamber came to an immediate halt. The puppets returned to their starting positions. You could have intercepted that spell with your body, Oxian, but once again, you focused too much on your direct opponent. Stay here as long as necessary, but you must understand that a tank's priority is protection, not destruction. You have 2 hours to get those constructs safely across. Oxian grunted and cracked his knuckles as the reality of the task began to sink in. Leaving the stubborn youth to his repetitive trials, Roland exited the second chamber and headed toward the third door, where the remaining students were waiting. Laren Vogerinard. This one is for you. Come with me. The young man nodded as the third door swung open. Laren's main problem was target priority and a lack of awareness when his teammates were struggling. His role was to support the primary damage dealer while introducing an element of unpredictability to the battlefield. It was a highly flexible position that allowed him to defend, attack, or operate independently when necessary. The problem was that he only wanted to do one thing: conceal himself and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. In a team-based scenario, however, that opportunity was not always available.